And I hope Anna's here. There she is.
I am here. Good morning. Thank you, Sharon, for the introduction. My name is Anna Loza, and with Rady Children's Hospital, I am a licensed clinical social worker and a mental health integration supervisor, having spent my career working with children and families, often in school-based programs. I share that in the hopes of aligning with you all somewhat and to offer my compassion and gratitude for how you show up every day for your students. We are thrilled to have an agenda for you today that is jam-packed with what we believe will be helpful and meaningful information related to the important work that you do. We have 3 knowledgeable presenters sharing their time with us today, speaking on topics including coping skills, supporting students in distress, and social media as it relates to student mental health. Between presentations, you'll want to stick around and stay tuned for mindfulness tips and strategies that we hope you might use to maintain calm and focus during your busy and stressful days, because we all have those, and I'm sure you do. You'll also want to stick with us to the end, like Sharon mentioned, for raffle prizes, and of course, those important details about how you'll be compensated for your time today. During the presentations, please feel free to interact, add questions and comments to the chat. Our team will monitor those questions. At the end of each presentation, we will choose 1 to 2 questions for speakers to respond to. But keep in mind, the questions that we don't have time to get to, we will compile all of those and we'll get answers to your questions, and we will share all of those following today's event. So if we don't get to your questions live today, we will share information with you as soon as we're done, or as soon as we have that information for you. So there's so many faces on the screen. It's a great way to start a Monday. It's exciting for me, and I don't even know all of you. So I'm checking with our team to see if we have our first presenter that's on. I see a nod from you, Sochi. Thank you. So let's get this party started with our first presenter, Dr. Jenica Paz, who will share about coping skills for elementary, middle, and high school students, because we know you all work with a range of students, or you come from a different age group, so she's covering the whole range for us. Dr. Paz hails from San Diego and is an assistant professor and co-director of the School Psychology program at San Diego State University. We are grateful to have her here to kick off this morning with us. And her full bio and the full bios of all of the presenters are available to you in your workshop materials. So Dr. Paz, without further ado, the Zoom floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. A quick mic check. Are you all able to hear me okay? Oh, love it. I love the head nods. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your cameras being on. I work in a graduate school, so as you can imagine, not that unfamiliar with how it runs in elementary and high school with cameras turned off. So this is just really wonderful to be able to see so many beautiful faces. So thank you. I am going to go ahead and turn my share screen on. Just give me a quick moment here. And let's see if I could gear this up. And I'm going to do one more check just to make sure that you all can see our screen. Are you able to see my slides all right without presenter view notes, so that's not distracting for you? Looking okay?
Yep, we're good.
Thank you, appreciate it. So I'm delighted and totally humbled that you all are sharing, that I get to share some space with all of you this morning. As reflected in my bio, I am a born and raised San Diegan, and I'm really can't be more passionate about getting together with my community, and all of the work that I do really is about pouring back into the cups of my own community that help foster my own resilience. I just want to start by saying a big thank you for letting me share space with all of you today and to kick off this wonderful, wonderful training that Rady's is hosting for all of you. So to begin, as was noted, I'm here at San Diego State. That means we are a big group that collaborates with a lot of local and Native Indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to begin by sharing a land acknowledgement especially for our Kumeyaay neighbors. So For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. They have nourished, healed, and protected and embraced them for many, the land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony, and we find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. So I wanted to first also give thanks to our Kumeyaay neighbors for allowing me to draw inspiration. This is a bit about who we are, and I'm going to invite you in just a moment to share. Hopefully you'll feel in a space where you're feeling open to sharing a bit, but I wanted to just help set the stage by hopefully establishing an environment where we can be in community with one another and sort of start in a grounded space. So my name is Dr. Jenna Capaz. I came from grandparents who migrated from Sonora, Mexico on my maternal side. I come from a father who is German and Dutch, and I come from roots in the Yaqui and Blackfoot nations. I'm a daughter of long-term foster parents and very loving foster parents. I'm a proud first-generation high school graduate, actually, and breaker of cycles of intergenerational poverty and trauma. I'm a fierce and passionate advocate for my students and communities that I serve. I completed my doctoral degree at UC Santa Barbara, and I have experience working in a variety of settings, from community hospital clinics, residential treatment facilities, and non-public school settings. So my research interests really involve an array of interests, but they're really centered on promoting positive youth development and promoting well-being among youth, especially youth of color and those from minoritized backgrounds. I have a special affinity for working with youth in foster care. And in our school psychology program here at San Diego State University, I primarily am teaching courses related to school-based mental health, counseling interventions for children and adolescents. I've taught an array of assessment courses as well, biological bases of behavior, taught a lot of classes here at San Diego State, but I think my wheelhouse really is in the school-based mental health. So it's a really beautiful marriage to be here today, to be able to share not only my training as a clinical psychologist and a school psychologist. And something that's really unique about our program at San Diego State is we're actually housed within our school counseling. So our department houses the school counseling program. So those are colleagues and students that I get to frequently interact with. I serve as a university supervisor for internship. So we've got lots of students, trainees placed within the San Diego Unified School District. So I have a nice, beautiful working relationship with many of your schools and supervisors. So if you're feeling so inclined, if you want to take a moment, if you'd be willing to share a few, reflect on a few salient strengths that you would say relate to your own identity, and just share a few core words. You can plop them in the chat within your comfort level. And so you can start with the prompt, I am, and let's see if I can finagle the chat box here. This prompt, I am, and just fill in a few core words that are congruent with your identity. I would love to see a bit of who I'm sharing this space with this morning. Thank you. They're rolling in. Thank you. Beautiful. So I see first-gen American-born Chinese, educator, mom, first-year elementary school counselor. Welcome. Peddler of hope. I love that. We could be friends. I'm into this. Lifelong learner, humbled, and hope to be a healer. I have a feeling, Dr. Shapiro, that those things are true for you. Genuine, kind, and fun. Program director for Ed Leadership. Awesome, at Alliant. Awesome. These are wonderful. Empowering advocate, integrity, compassion. These are absolutely beautiful. I'm a Latina, mother, wife, and helping professional. Bienvenidos. I did forget to mention another salient aspect of my identity. I'm a mom. I have a 3-year-old. And so a lot of what I practice, what I preach, I get to practice, and I get to find some of my own blind spots and weaknesses. So I'm also grateful for that opportunity. All right, well, thank you. Please keep them rolling in. These are really beautiful. I'm really enjoying this, and take time to read through some of your peers' comments today too. So rather than agenda or our orientation or our goals for today, I really would rather focus it on being some intentions, because I don't see this as something that you talk about, learn about, and then we're done and you can master it, but it's just some intentions to cultivate. And here are some of the ideas I'd have to like to share with all of you. You can feel free to throw them in the dumpster when you're all finished with me today, but here's some hopeful mindsets that I'm hoping to cultivate, or hopefully maybe tap into. I see that there's just from some of your responses here in the chat box, I can see we have a range of folks who've been in the field for quite some time, and we also have some very starting out first year school counselors. And so whether you've been doing this for a while and you might be looking for some inspiration to get outside of your comfort zone or do something a little bit different, or whether you're looking to hit the ground running with some tools, I hope that this time today will help inspire some of that within you. Maybe it's also like, hey, that's not for me, and you know what, that's inspiring too, and that's totally okay. But some of the, I'm calling them mindsets that I'm hoping to cultivate or tap into, include moving beyond the trauma-informed care to more healing-centered practices and approaches. Nothing wrong with trauma-informed care. We are living in a time where we know about 100% of our youth, and adults included, have been experiencing some really traumatic events and aftermath from the pandemics and from so much more. So we know we are already in that space of living with and dealing with trauma, but where do we go from there? It's one thing to just sort of understand that there's trauma and what the reactions are, but how are we going to promote healing and post-traumatic growth after these experiences? And so what I'm hoping that we can do today is take much of what you've maybe learned about trauma-informed care and kind of build upon that. And I have some tips and strategies that are really centered within more healing-centered approaches. And then just a nice reminder, refresher about connection before correction. We'll get into that just a bit. Before we're wanting to dive into working with coping skills with youth, we want to make sure we have that rapport and relationship established. And then across all of the different interventions and strategies that we'll review today, I want you to always have in the back of your mind these considerations, how we could take each of these and adapt and modify so that we know that they're developmentally appropriate and scaled, thinking about our neurodiverse learners, thinking about our students that are youth of color, students who are LGBTQIA+, and their symptom presentation. What I mean by symptom presentation is, are the coping skills and the strategies and activities we're engaging with, are they actually aligned with the students presenting mental health needs? So let's say if they're presenting with more anxiety and it's a much more internal presentation, are we making sure that we're selecting strategies that are going to be conducive to that particular symptom presentation, rather than just sort of throwing everything in the kitchen sink at our youth? And from what I gathered in times with chatting with colleagues in preparation for this meeting, I heard that there was a real need and desire for these really practical applications. So contrary to what I do in my classes with my students, I'm not going to give a whole bunch of research, evidence-based statistics and breakdowns of the theories prior to getting into some of this, but I wanted you to be able to walk away today with some new tools in your toolbox, or a refresher, a reminder of some things that you might already be very well skilled in and can breathe some fresh air back into. So I'm drawing some inspiration from strengths-based and solution focused methodology. I know here at San Diego State in our school counseling program, solution focused is and narrative therapy. Those are some of the big areas of training that our school counselors receive, and so maybe some of this will jive if you're from the school psych or the school counseling program here at San Diego State. Also, I'll draw some inspiration from cognitive behavioral interventions, specifically from trauma-focused cognitive behavioral interventions, because we know we are in this sort of post-traumatic growth stage. And then lastly, and my most favorite, are positive psychological interventions. And I do consider myself to be a positive psychologist, but I'm grappling every day with this identity crisis of not wanting to feed into the cycles of toxic positivity, because there's nothing more annoying and also irritating for our youth to be told, let's just have a positive mindset. Let's have a positive mindset, we can get through it. So that is not what I mean by being a positive psychologist. And I hope once we get to some of those interventions, that will make sense for you. This is from a recent article I was able to have the honor of publishing alongside some absolutely incredible colleagues. One of our main pieces in our introduction really helped highlight that we are in this space where public policy and mental health experts are emphasizing the need to monitor well-being. So it's not just about reducing pathology, but it's actually looking at and promoting well-being and provide equitable access to essential services to help youth build upon their psychosocial strengths and mitigate the traumatic experiences. So each of you in this room are the healing bearers. So you are the champions that are really helping to bring forth this mission and this very, very critical need within our own community. Invisible backpack. If I could have a hand raise, if we were in the room together, this would be a lot quicker, but I have a feeling this is probably not new to many of you, this analogy of the invisible backpack, but in case you haven't heard it yet, I feel that this is just such a fitting metaphor for what many of our youth are bringing within every day within the school environment with them. And this goes that children carry a lot of things around with them in those backpacks, not just school supplies. They also carry around thoughts, feelings, and experiences from the past. And those items are in the invisible backpack. So I wondered if y'all would take a moment and join me in thinking about, in light of present day circumstances, what might be some of the specific added weights that youth of color might be carrying in their backpacks that we should be mindful of amidst current events. So I'll give y'all just a minute to reflect on that. What might be some of the added weights that might be present in the backpacks of our youth of color that we might want to be extra mindful of, especially in light of current events? All right, I can see I'm in the right space with the right people here. Fear, systemic institutional racism, absolutely. Loss, language, absolutely. SES status, family dynamics, overall stability and safety, absolutely. Parent and caregiver job insecurity, food insecurities, families who are maybe navigating divorce and safety, not good enough, grief, poverty, fear specifically for family, and sense of constant vigilance, absolutely. Stress, safety, inflation. You guys are hitting the nail on the head. Can't identify with peers, parent unemployment, worried about if they're going to be evicted or have enough money for food, absolutely. Lack of social skills, confidence, deportation, that is a huge one. Thank you, Ramirez, and I don't know if it's Tanya, but that's how it's showing on here, but thank you for bringing that one up. That's one that we actually do focus a lot. I have a bilingual grant here at San Diego State that I'm a part of. It's our Puede grant. And this is something that we work with students in Rosa Parks Elementary School. And that's something that we often talk about and give some attention to because it's an absolute real stress for families. Thank you. These are absolutely impactful. So thank you for bringing these up. So it's not only that our youth are having to deal with effects of trauma, but layered for our youth of color, especially, these are a lot more of these added weights. And so I wanted to set the tone with that because it's helping us think about, of course, this is the sort of classic trauma, that's sort of the classic trauma-informed care metaphor, but how do we move beyond that from trauma-informed to more healing-centered? And so I wanted, this is again in line with some of the mindsets we're trying to cultivate today, but thinking about the rhetoric that we're using and the power that our words have to actually shape our interactions with youth and families. So if we're saying just a difference from saying like, I'm trauma-informed to I'm healing-centered, what kind of connotations pop up for you immediately when you hear the word trauma-informed? Okay, For me, you're welcome to write them down if you'd like. For me, trauma-informed, very clinical, and I'm a clinical psychologist, so immediately I start thinking about DSM, I start thinking about intensive acute individual level interventions. It's about pathology reduction, very, very much individual focus. Like, okay, we have this youth experiencing trauma, let's diagnose them, let's get them set up with a treatment plan, and let's work on them. Let's work on reducing the things that are making it hard for them to navigate their everyday life. But it's very much on this individual level of healing and deficit base. When we think about healing-centered educators, healing-centered practices, what comes to mind when we're coming from that sort of perspective? The aim and objective for healing-centered, it's pretty clear just from the term. It's focused on interventions aimed at promoting well-being and healing rather than symptom reduction or reducing pathology. It incorporates more holistic, culturally sensitive, spiritual aspects, promoting civic action and collective healing, tapping into community supports and resources, leaning on the families, bringing the families in as a part of the team. And so I wonder if you can imagine any differences in the way that you might imagine carrying out your practice and your work with youth, if you're imagining coming from more of a healing-centered space versus trauma-informed. You don't need to, take time to talk too much. If we had more time together, I'd have us probably do some workshopping and break out into some groups to chat about how you might envision some differences in your practice, or what if this was the language your admin were using to inform your service delivery. So just something to think about, something to maybe cultivate and channel, learn more on, but it is something that I feel like has some power to move the pendulum forward to more of these healing focused rather than just trauma-informed pathology reduction. This is an example of rhetoric of a healing-focused clinician or educator. This top one, that line that has the line crossed out here, might be and is something that I've definitely heard in sort of lunchroom chats in teacher break rooms and so on and so forth. But what is wrong with this student? They are so, you can fill in the blank. Instead, using sentences and languages such as what experiences are impacting the student's behavior and learning and what's going well. So to borrow from Brian McClure, who's a phenomenal school psychologist, his whole kind of motto and mantras, it's from what's wrong to what's strong. And some of y'all may have heard about some of his work as well, but it's about from what's wrong to what's strong. Connection before correction. So you all may be familiar with this too. This is from the positive discipline literature by Jane Nelson. And so it's just another reminder that before we're embarking on the journey of healing with our students and our youth, it's about creating that connection. And it helps set the tone of being firm and kind. And I call this firm with my students, that whether they appreciate that or not, I don't know, but that's the word I like to use is firm. And it's modeled by statements such as, I love you, and the answer is no. Or within the school setting, if you're working with a youth that's maybe having some trouble with boundaries or kind of limit pushing, we care about your learning, and the answer is still no. That's not a safe choice. But things like, you are more important to me than your grades. I wonder what your grades mean to you. I love you and I have faith we can find a respectful solution. So of course, this one geared towards parents, but there is a whole positive discipline literature for teachers actually too. But another example of that is, you know what, I believe in you and I bet that we can find a solution together to this challenge. So you're establishing that connection without automatically dragging the student into having to do something different to correct their misbehavior, right? But you're acknowledging and you're sitting with them in that difficult space and time before we're engaging in the work that we're aiming to do. I know how much that meant to you, or I know how much you wanted that, and I'm sorry we can't have it right now. Using the we and joining them also helps too, besides just always saying you. This is another piece where I find it's a powerful space to build upon cultural assets and making sure that what's salient to that youth's identity is also heard. So starting with their story and their narrative of what happened and building upon that, I think is also a really beautiful space and a way to make sure that the work we're engaging in, especially with our culturally and linguistically diverse youth, that it's more appropriate and matched to their needs. All right, a little bit into coping skills, and we'll get into some examples here. So I had a funny thought this morning, and it was the analogy that coping skills are, especially for maybe our teens, are akin to our self-care. So another thing I would do if I was in person with all of you would be that hand raise of how many of you have been told, don't forget to practice your self-care. Actually, can I see a little hand raise? How many have heard that? Don't forget to practice self-care. It's important. You got to do it. You got to do it. Yeah. And it's my trigger. I'll be totally honest. The moment my husband's like, you got to practice your self-care. It's just, you have to do it. And I just want to say, you can go blank off right now because it's triggering. And maybe it's my time working in residential facilities, but I have found that the term coping skills is a trigger for a lot of students, especially those who have a lot of system involvement in and out of residential. They teens especially have the best BS detectors, and they'll throw it right back at you. But what if we approach and think about coping skills as self-care for teens, and we talk about it as self-love? So I'm just inviting you to think about, if we're having a student with an IEP, or we're working in gen ed, whatever the population that you're working with, but the goal has to relate to coping skills. Just be mindful that word, you might not get them back in the door. But if we think about, we're gonna do some self-love, we're gonna think about self-care together, and I'm going to join you on it because it's an area I could also grow in. That's coming from a much more reciprocal relationship, and you might have a little bit more buy-in that way. So I just wanted to start with that because I had that analogy this morning, and for teens especially, I think that could be a little bit more palatable. But basic level tools that we use to manage tough emotions and help us all cope with stress, they do need to be taught and practiced on a regular basis, preferably when they're in a calm and regulated state. You all will have the chance to go through some wonderful distress tolerance skills later today, but just as students need to be taught reading, writing, and math, coping skills are no different. These need to be taught and modeled and practiced regularly. I love co-regulation and practicing these together. There is such a difference between adaptive and maladaptive coping skills as well. So the adaptive, as you can imagine, are ones that are going to really work to help return that student to homeostasis, to cope with that challenge in a productive way. But examples of maladaptive coping skills, students have a lot of them. These are the things they're probably getting referred to you in the first place for doing. They're probably reacting in some way that's productive for their survival, and it's kind of getting some sort of a need met at the time, but it might have not very good consequences. So we want to teach them that, hey, that is one way to react and cope, but there's some better choices, and let's explore what those look like. What the maladaptive coping skills could look like within the schools could be, the obvious ones that we know right off the bat are harm to self or harm to others. But they could also be name calling, shutting down, and avoidance is also another maladaptive. Using physical violence or rumors, threats, harming property, damage or throwing things, blaming others, and negative self-talk. So those are all examples you could explore. What are you already doing when you're faced with a challenge? They might be able to say, this is kind of what I'm doing, or that might be what teachers, parents, and others are reporting to you. So it's helpful to give some of that psychoeducation too. They probably are already coming to you with some skills, but they might not lead to the best outcomes. Again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but one of the other things to think about is, are the coping skills that we're trying to cultivate and grow within the student, are they aligned with their mental health symptoms? So more of those internalizing versus externalizing, or some combo. I already talked about this. Using the term coping skills with caution can be a big trigger. You can come up with a fun name, invite them to help name it, name it to tame it. So I've used chill skills in the past with youth. I had this corner in my office where I would have like what's now the cool fidget boxes you can easily order on Amazon, but I used to like hand pick them for each student and have these little boxes, and I would call them like vacation corner. So they would have fun things like, you know, with these in there and all that, all those kind of goodies. But I liked calling it vacation corner because in that I'm also building in positive visualization. And so it's already a nice little prompt to help get into a more calm state. So finding Zen, I know, especially if you get the opportunity to work with occupational therapists, or you might have an OT room where you work, or teachers do a beautiful job of setting up like Zen dens within their classrooms. Maybe it's your counseling office, that's the Zen den too. But all of those could be incorporated when thinking about coping skills. Another easy one is just thinking about all 5 senses when coming up with coping skills. I love smell. I think smell for me, we know it is the part of the brain that has the most neurons and carries the most memory and the most weight. It's absolutely powerful. So for me, thinking about pairing, maybe for you, it might be taste and having some kind of a delicious chocolate while you're doing some breathing or visualization, that might help really bring you down, but not forgetting about all 5 senses. I love to pair smell with deep breathing, and especially for youth. And I have a lotion here from one of the youth I used to work with, actually, and it was this lavender. I'm all about show and tell, so enjoy the show and tell moments I've got around here. But it was a lavender spa lotion, and so we would use it, you know, rub in really mindfully, and then engage in the different kind of deep breathing exercises while actually smelling. So there's lots of variations of that, but I just wanted to throw that out as we're thinking about some of these strategies to not leave out all 5 senses. I also loved candles. Of course, in schools, you can't really light the candle, but you can have some on hand that they can smell or pick out. With my teens, they really got into aromatherapy. I have mine on now. I always have mine on, but having them come up with their own combination with the aromatherapy machine of their favorite kind of essential oils. Teens love to do that. And again, it's something that they can kind of be active in creating and having them think through what each smell reminds them of. Does it come up with a positive memory they can associate with it? Later down the road, when they're in that immediate need to have access to a coping skill, they've already practiced, they have their preferred combo that they can use in that aromatherapy machine. And that might be, you know, just the thing they need for a quick 5-minute reset before they can go back and engage in their classroom. From CBT and neuroscience, we know that active strategies can be a lot more powerful than passive. So going on those walks or, you know, whatever that more active, thinking of positive affirmation, something that has more of an active undertone versus binge watching. It can be an immediate distraction. Don't get me wrong. When I have those moments, I love to just zone out and do nothing. But what happens when we're done binging is that we are flooded again with all of those things that we put on the back burner and we haven't had the chance to work through them. So especially with our middle and high school students, having the breaking that cycle if they're used to doing a lot of passive strategies to help invite them to think of some more active things that they can throw into their toolkit. Okay, I'm gonna set this tone with all of you. If we were there in person together and had more time, I would love to set up different vignettes and tackle different parts of this, but I wanted to give this vignette to all of you. And then as I'm sharing the next couple of specific tools and examples, I want you to be thinking about ways in which some of the strategies and coping skills would work for a student like Rashay. So Rashay is inspired by a client that I used to work with. Rashay was a 14-year-old transgender teen with preferred pronouns of she and her in a non-public school setting. She had a lot of beautiful cultural assets that we like to celebrate, integrate in our treatment together and work together. She was biracial, half Black and half Caucasian. Her family were from the US South and from a Baptist faith. Lots of strength. She was highly social. She was upstander for justice and pro-social behavior towards friends, super creative, gifted singer, a lot of interest in music, makeup, sports, and fashion. Some of the concerns and part of our time together was due to her having symptoms of, and again, these came at different times, so don't be alarmed. I know some of these might not jive together necessarily in the DSM, but She was displaying symptoms of bipolar, episodes of psychosis, a former diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, plus ADHD. She had a lot of struggles with self-harming behaviors, behavioral regression. So when in an acute or distressed state, would actually resort to some like toddler-like behavior, including like crawling on the ground. Oppositionality when she felt unheard or not believed, and then a host of different sort of specific learning disabilities that were present within the classroom. So the main goal that I wanted you just to zone in on is this goal 3 here. And this was about her goal related to coping skills. And so the goal was that she would effectively utilize active emotion regulation skills. Yes, I did write this. I would write it differently now, but I think this was back when I was a postdoc. So this is best I came up with, but just, you know, to cue for maybe some of the youth that you're working with, active emotion regulation skills daily to prevent maladaptive behaviors. And the youth will implement emotion regulation or coping skills independently at least 1 time per day with no more than 1 prompt. I also want to share that this is not the space to reinvent the wheel. This is an example of thousands of different kinds of coping skills charts and toolkits that are out there all over the internet for your, you know, for your inspiration. But I would say organizing some of these different activities for your youth in whichever way feels congruent to you can be really, really helpful. And just knowing that the coping skills that you're working on and working towards with your youth have to feel intuitive, and there might be something that's working one day that doesn't work anymore. And that's the same for us and what we consider self-care to really help us reboot and de-stress. What's working, you know, this week might not work for us next week. So just being really flexible. But I like this visual because it helps us think about the overall span and the things that we can consider to help build within our students' coping skills toolkit. So things that are in the active side, things that can help you find your calm, getting creative, connecting with other people, and shifting mindset. So I kind of like these different domains to help us think about. So practical strategies, thinking about exploring what the students are already coming in with and what they're already doing. They might already have some tools that are working for them, and we want to build upon those. Practice and refine over time. Practice, practice, practice. You will have a time to do working with distress, working with students who are in that active kind of crisis state in a bit. The beautiful thing with coping skills is that these can all be done in a proactive nature and practicing before they're in a crisis state and refining over time. So can be a goal to always be talking about incorporating coping skills. And I broke these down, some of the examples that I'll run through here with all of you. There are some activities involving like worksheets and toolkits, lots of games, art and music, and then positive psychological interventions. So I wanted to give, sorry about that, I want to give some examples. So for coping skills, and especially helpful for exploring, I have a worksheet I'd love to share with you and then show how I've adapted that into an active game that's really, really fun to do with elementary school kiddos. For our middle and high school students, how we can use a similar worksheet, but it's called Cope Ahead, inspired by dialectical behavioral therapy, and I Learned Best activity. So show some examples. So I'm giving lots of kudos and credits to San Diego Center for Children, where I did used to work. And there's various ones of these, even on, online, Pinterest. The Wholehearted School Counselor on Instagram and her blog have some really wonderful visuals as well. But this is actually something that I will use in school-based mental health and teach my students, and they've brought it into IEPs on cases where they're evaluating referrals of emotional disturbance. And it's really beautiful because it helps you do this collaboratively with the student. It's a way to also centralize if their culture, spirituality, and things that are working for them, but also get a sense of what are the triggers. So prior to needing to engage in a coping skill, but what are the actual triggers that are setting them off? So the first box up here, which is in the yellow, has to do with triggers. So when you're angry, upset, or scared, what makes it more difficult for you? And they can go through and select those. And And then what are the body cues and warning signs that let others know you're upset, angry, or scared? And then number 3 on here, which is in the light blue, are the calming strategies and positive self-statements. So what are some coping skills and positive self-statements that will help you feel better and calm down when you're angry, upset, or scared? So you can go through these together, you can practice them together. One of my favorite ways to introduce this with children is actually through the coping fishing, let's go fishing game. You guys remember this classic game, the let's go fishing? So it does turn on, the batteries still work. I haven't pulled this out in a bit, but essentially for each of these little photos that you see here in the calming strategy, oh, I actually got one on the first try. I'm pretty impressed here. So I have cut those little photos out and I put them, I'll get a different one. I put them on the bottom of these little fish. And here's a nice one. And so they would, you know, use their fishing pole, get one, and then they would read it on the bottom. And this one says journaling. And so we talk about what if it's a skill they didn't know or they don't know what the heck this tool was, journaling. Have you tried that before? Has it worked? Do you want to practice it? Okay, do we want to keep it and put it in our own little coping skills pond, or do we want to throw it back? Or do we want to put it in our own little coping skills fish tank, or do we want to throw it back in the pond and try something else? So it's kind of a nice, fun way to explore and build upon some of those skills and practice with youth in advance, especially helpful for our elementary school kiddos. Cope Ahead is really helpful for our teens. And so these are helping them think about how they can skillfully handle a situation, what coping skills would they use, say they're feeling anxiety in class, and they can cope ahead for a future stressful event. So this one's really helpful for my middle school and teens. Okay, and then another one that's inspired by cognitive behavioral therapy is the kind of negative thought stopping, thought interruption. And so we, you know, if we're having a student experiencing anxiety or a lot of negative self-talk, just like an annoying song, a bad song that gets stuck in our head, those negative thoughts can come and eat away as well. But we can practice by saying stop to those annoying songs, and then we could say go or play to a more happy or cheerful song that helps sort of replace that negative self-talk with something more positive. And so this is a fun one to use. Elementary through high school, it's really fun. I've had a blast with this particular client with the vignette you saw. We had a blast because they were really into music. So for this one, we had them actually play their music with their happy song. And so to save time, I'm not gonna toggle through it, but one of the happy songs that I love to use is Build Me Up Buttercup. So I'll go ahead and can't leave without playing a bit of that. So again, you can have it really tailored to the youth and their preferred music. You can have a lot of fun there. All right, so for our, let me check in on time. I know we're getting close here. So, okay, almost there. Some additional positive psychological interventions that can support coping. Mindful breathing, we talked about those too. There's a ton out there, but I really like to pair whatever your favorite one is with some visualization. Cultivating strengths and positive postings. You help the youth identify their top 3 to 5 strengths and use one in a new way when faced with a challenge. And so I could show a quick example of that. Gratitude journal, you've probably heard of, but some fun spins on them are also thinking of 3 funny things or 3 things that went well today. This can really be adapted anywhere from middle to high school. I really like to do the I learned best when with my middle and high school students. And let me share examples of what these actually look like for you before we head off so you can have some visuals. So the I learned best activity, you have them identify 3 things related to 3 things to seek related to when they learn best and 3 things to avoid. And so this could be really helpful for helping them help track how often these occur, and then they can kind of revisit. When we're in this space of virtual learning as well, it's really helpful to have them revisit this and think, okay, when I'm in an online setting, what really helps me? I can focus best when these things are there. And these are the things that sort of get in my way. So again, these can be really powerful coping mechanisms because they can learn what things in their environment are conducive to their learning and their well-being and what things are maybe a little more struggling. Some therapeutic grounding, again, if you need examples, these are hyperlinked if you want some scripts, but mindful belly breathing paired with visualization can be really powerful. some positive postings. So this was, I wanted to show some visuals. This was another way that a coping skills activity was adapted in an online version. This was using Jamboard. And so this has to do with identifying some strengths and using it in a new way. So the prompt was to first they can draw themselves and draw any features of their identity that were important, and then think of 3 positive traits that are about qualities about themselves. And so these are actually from some of my grad students, but you can kind of get a sense of what some of the things that were salient to them. I am patient, I am love, passionate. And they also included what some of the triggers were to the distressing event that needed them to engage in the coping. So one of my students was feeling frustrated. They couldn't help a child stop them from feeling nervous or upset. Okay, and then the last 2 slides here are just a bunch of resources. You all will have access to these. I've organized them for you by middle, elementary, and high school. There are these wonderful, Go Zen is probably one you're familiar with, but they have so many resources for children, families, and providers. And there's also this Stress for COVID-19, a course for teens that's very specific for them. A lot of just phenomenal and free worksheets, toolkits, things like that, things for educators, counselors, and parents. So I want you guys to make sure you can walk away and navigate some of these. And the very last has to do with wellness specific focus resources. So our Project Co-Vitality focuses on social emotional health. And so there's a variety. You can click on any of these here, including games and apps. Things related to belief in self, like self-efficacy, persistence. And if you know a student struggling in those areas, there are tons and tons and tons of actual interventions and strategies that you could use to sort of tailor and adapt for your individual students that you're working with. So sorry to have to rush a lot through that at the end. Definitely don't have enough time, but I do appreciate you all taking some time to walk through some of this with me today. So I will go ahead and turn it over to our moderating crew. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paz. We are actually good on time at the moment. So I'm not sure, I haven't seen any particular questions in the chat, but if anyone does have any, we do have a couple of minutes.
Yes, I know I rushed through some of those strategies. Feel free to ask if there's other particular questions. Like I said, I think what's really important is that each of you are also tapping into your own strengths as school counselors. If you're artistic, if you're musical, if you love to be with nature, that's a beautiful way to, you know, kind of break down that hierarchical relationship and let them know a bit about you, but let your own strengths shine as well. And when it comes to coping skills, it's just such a huge, it's a huge domain. And again, like I said, it's not somewhere to reinvent the wheel by any means, but let your own strengths sort of guide some of your practice too, or invite the students to join you on some of the things that you're really passionate about. But again, assuming that the students already have the capability and the skills and that you're going to be there with them to help develop and cultivate those over time, I think is really important. Letting them lead, I think we often in our field are not giving enough credit to the potential that our youth have. And they do have so many strengths that are waiting to be uncovered. This might be a flip. I hope it's a flip and a shift maybe for you from coming at it from this very deficit, let's just reduce how much anxiety, but it's actually, let's tap into those skills they have, and then we'll build them together. And that's the whole spirit today and sort of my aim. And I don't know if it's in line with a lot of the training you've received in the past or a little different, but it's just a different mindset that I'm throwing out there for us to think about together today. So you're welcome to reach out to me. I'm here at SDSU, I'm local. I work with San Diego Unified a lot of my students, I might see some of you doing site visits. So if you do happen to see me, please come up and say hi, introduce yourselves. My email has been shared, so please feel free to reach out. I'm open to consultations anytime. I love doing school-wide wellness screeners. Shout out to Dr. Shapiro, because she's been my partner in crime on that with some other schools and other projects. But please feel free to, to stay connected after today.
I know I'm taking away in particular the idea of connection before correction. And I am a huge believer in trauma-informed care. So I love the shift to healing-informed practices. I'm wondering if anyone else, while we're still together, has any particular strategies that they found helpful. Or again, if you have a question to ask while we have Dr. Paz with us.
Hi, this is Deb, and I'm over at at Hardy Elementary. But when we were talking about what's wrong to what's strong, I like that, because what's strong is in a kid's circle of control, and I feel like that kind of shifts that dynamic to the student in a positive way. So that's what I'm going to be implementing.
Thank you for sharing that reflection. Yes, with you there. Thank you.
Thank you for talking about the breathing. So I've been listening to some blogs, and they've been talking about SEAL breathing. And since we have the Navy SEALs in San Diego, it's the 4x4 breathing, in 4, hold 4, out 4. So I'm going to try and find some videos to show the kids, like maybe these cool, tough Navy SEALs, you know, doing like the breathing exercises. I thought maybe they'd kind of get a kick out of that, because it's kind of homegrown, fun thing. So thank you for sharing about the breathing.
That's what it's about. It's about adapting, modifying. Like, there are so many manualized treatments, and I'm here to say, like, they're wonderful. We know they're rooted in science, but that's sometimes not enough to get that level of connection, especially with our culturally and linguistically diverse youth. And you're tapping into something that I could see that like in a boys group. Oh my gosh, that could be a phenomenal adaptation. But it's finding what's of interest and salience to that student, and getting creative and not being afraid to get creative. And we get stuck in a rut. Like, I won't lie, I get stuck, like, oh, I get to do self-care, what am I going to do now, Pilates again? Like, I get stuck in the same rut. So do, you know, all of us as clinicians. And so I love that. And with the breathing, that's one that we know works, and it's just got endless ways to adapt and modify. So that's really beautiful. I love that. Thanks for sharing that example. And I didn't even get to, I'm seeing thank you for plopping in what kind of books and things you're using. I didn't even get into the fact about bibliotherapy and the tons of different books that are out there that you can also integrate into practice, especially helpful for elementary school kiddos. There's a positive affirmations book called, what's it called? I think I Am is really what it's called. And I love it as a way to model think positive affirmations and cultivating that mindset. Because that's another one when they're test taking and kind of stuck and just left on their own, is how can they have some of these sort of rehearsed positive affirmations that can really carry them through too. But there's so many amazing tools and resources and books out there. So I love that you all are sharing your own knowledge with one another in the chat box too. Beautiful. And please feel free to adopt. I mean, you're welcome to use the tools that are in there, come up with your own. I have the Jenga game out here too. I've done coping skills using Jenga, where you can also have the different colored blocks or different styles of coping skills too, whether they're active types of things that they can do or self statements. You can organize the categories however you'd like, but it's really fun to incorporate it in games and makes it a little less threatening for the youth also. Oh yeah, breathe like a bear. I like that one too. The cookie breaths, you know, having them think about what's their favorite food, and that's going in the oven and out the oven. And before they could take a bite, it's really, really hot. So they have to cool it down. So let's take, you know, 4 or 5 seconds of a deep breath in and smell. Oh, I do love cookies. I am a cookie monster. That's the only treat that I ever really crave. And so for me, it's always the cookies, and I'm taking a nice big smell of how wonderful those warm, delicious chocolate chip cookies smell. And then I have to blow on them to cool it down before I can take a bite. And so we do really slow. Let's try to get to, you know, 5 or 7 seconds out too. And then we can take a bite and be silly together. I've worked with all ages, but I would say that probably the bulk of my work has been with the elementary school kiddos. So I have 4 days adaptations for elementary level students. So that's where my silly side is always there.
Dr. Paz, there's a question about whether or not you come out to sites to do staff professional development.
You know what? For the most part, I have been invited by, so like I said, I'm a university internship supervisor. So I've done some in that capacity for my own interns who've reached out and connected and know we have this organic need at our school. Would you be willing to come and chat about it? But I am always open to the ideas. I am co-directing our programs this semester, so my schedule's a little more chaotic, but please reach out. And if there's a way that we can coordinate and collaborate, I would love to. Again, nothing makes me more fulfilled than doing this, joining you and knowing that together we're thinking about creative ways to meet the needs of our youth today. So please do not feel, don't even hesitate to reach out. So again, I'm a full-time professor at SDSU. I really wish I had time for my own side gig to do things like this a lot more with more frequency. But I would say, please just email me. And if we can make it work, I'm more than open to trying to fit it in the schedule. So.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's a that's a good one. Yeah, use what you have. Now we're all hungry, so we're gonna leave with that.
Yeah, everyone wants cookies.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Paz. We very much appreciate you being here this morning to spend time with us. And I'm sure you'll be hearing from people with questions. If we have any other questions come our way, we will send those to you so that we can get answers for our guests today.
Fantastic. Thank you again, everybody. It was really lovely to be here with all of you. Enjoy the rest of the, I'm going to stay on for as long as I can, but I do have some student meetings to pop in and out of. But thank you so much for sharing space with me today. Thank you.
All right. So now to shift gears to our first mindfulness message. I do want to avoid triggering anyone and not send the message that you have to remember to practice your self-care. But let's take another idea from Dr. Paz and focus on self-love as we talk about mindfulness. So I imagine being a counselor can be a juggling act. Your days are filled with never-ending to-do lists, including students to check in on, maybe parents to call, classrooms to visit, groups to run, meetings, and on and on. With all of the demands of the job, and I'm sure tough stories that you likely hear about the challenges your students are facing, it's easy to see how you might become exhausted and just sometimes maybe feel out of sorts. So one way to stay healthy is to intentionally build in short focused breaks throughout your day to practice mindfulness. And I know that that's much easier said than done. When we practice mindfulness, we're intentionally hitting the pause button or the reset button, however you want to think about it, and turning our attention to nothing but the present moment. And so all we're going to do right now is take a moment to breathe, which we've already heard a lot about this morning. It sounds strange, but sometimes we get so caught up in our day that we actually forget to breathe. At the very least, we get caught in a rhythm of shallow breathing that leaves our bodies and minds short of the oxygen that they need to be at their best. I mean, our bodies know how to breathe. We breathe all day long, but how are we breathing? So when you find yourself in this state, take a pause. Close your eyes and breathe in and out slowly and deeply. So let's do this now. Feel free to turn cameras off, whatever your preference is. And while standing or sitting, if you're standing, it might be helpful to lean your back up against a wall. Be aware of your feet grounded on the floor. And go ahead and lower or close your eyes and notice where you feel your breath. If you can't feel anything, place your hand on your stomach and notice how your hand gently rises and falls with your breath. Take a deep breath in and scan your entire body up and down, from the tips of your toes all the way to the top of your head, and then back down again while you're breathing out. As you inhale and exhale, breathe deep in through your nose into your chest so that your belly fills with the air. And then when exhaling, breathe out through your mouth and control the air as it leaves your lungs. Make breathing in and out right now your only responsibility. When your mind wanders, and it will, just bring your attention back to your breath. It might be helpful to think of breathing in peace on the inhale and breathing out stress on the exhale. Listen to your breath as it goes in and out of your nose. Feel it as it fills your lungs and control it as your lungs empty. Take a couple more deep, intentional breaths, being mindful of your body at your own calm pace. Now open your eyes and rejoin us. You can turn cameras back on if you're ready to. So now that we're refocused, let's meet our next speaker. Our next presenter is Leonora Krugelitz, who holds a master's in health communication, and she currently serves as a senior high school advisor of the JED Foundation. And the JED Foundation is a national nonprofit organization that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for teens and young adults. Again, like our other presenters, Leonora's full bio is available in your workshop materials. And Leonora today will share with us about supporting students in distress, including considerations for all the various ages that you work with, elementary, middle, and high school students. So welcome, Leonora. Thank you for being here today, and the time is now yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. I will go ahead and share my screen and just make sure it's all set up, and we'll go from there. Okay. Just setting it up. I have a few monitors, so I'm just making sure it's all you can see it properly. Okay. Are you all seeing my speaker notes? I just want to make sure it's actually the right monitor.
You have to switch it. We see your speaker now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, perfect. Let me just go ahead and do that. Okay, is that working? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. Like Anna was saying, my name is Leah Krugelitz and I'm a senior high school advisor at the JED Foundation. My background is in youth suicide prevention and public health. And I'm really passionate about upstream prevention approaches, which is really relevant to the topic of supporting students in distress. So during this presentation, we'll discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on youth mental health, action steps for supporting students in distress, including multi-tiered systems of support approach, along with sharing some resources. So just a note as we go into this discussion, talking about suicide, of course, can always be challenging. So I encourage you to take a break if needed. As we just kind of did through that mindful exercise, it's important to be mindful of taking care of our own mental health. So a little bit about the JED Foundation and who we are. So JED is a nonprofit organization out of New York City that has been around for the past 2 decades. We work primarily with high schools and colleges to prevent suicide and protect emotional health. So we work with high schools and colleges to strengthen their mental health, substance misuse, and suicide prevention programs and systems. We encourage community awareness and understanding and action for young adult mental health. So we're currently working with about 75 high schools across the country and a few thousand college campuses. So a little more detail about who we are and what we do. So we have what's called a comprehensive approach, which you can see on that wheel, that really focuses on a broader systematic framework to support and improve student mental health and reduce risk for suicide. So we're not solely focusing on one thing, and this really relates to MTSS, which we'll talk about as well. And some of the domains that we help schools improve upon would be encourage help-seeking behaviors, promote mean safety, promote student access to effective mental health treatment. And we use a technical assistance model to help schools evaluate their systems and policies related to student mental health. We're currently working with San Diego Unified on a district level since last spring, and we're launching implementation of Judd High School with 5 high schools in the district this fall, which we're really, really excited about. You all are doing really great work related to student mental health and well-being. So the first question I have for you is, which student population do you work with? And I think there might be a poll associated with this. Yeah. So just would love to hear from you, and then can kind of gear the conversation that way. Let's take a moment to answer it and share those responses in a moment. Okay, and once that looks like it's everyone has majority of answered, would love to see what those responses are. I don't know if I have access to that, but Sharon, if you're able to, okay, perfect. So I think everyone should be able to see that. Okay, great. So we have a range, a lot of elementary professionals and kind of a mix of others. So appreciate that. And then I see some in the chat, both. Okay, thank you. So although our foundation primarily works at the high school level and college level, the information throughout this training will be relevant to supporting elementary and middle school students, and encourage you to participate via chat. I think these trainings are a really great opportunity to learn from others. So if there's information that you find relevant and would like to share other resources, please do so. So let's talk about youth mental health in general and establish the need for this type of work. So we know that based on the research, 1 in 4 young adults experiences a mental health challenge each year, yet less than half, 50% are receiving treatment. So we know that there's a big gap. 60% of first-year college students have reported that they wish they were better prepared emotionally to leave high school. You all probably know that suicide is unfortunately the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds. And as we talked about in Dr. Paz's presentation, that there's specific populations that are at increased risk. So BIPOC students, LGBTQ+ youth, international students, first generation students face additional mental health stressors that can place them at incremental risk for adverse outcomes. So what we always advocate for through our programming is equitable implementation. So understanding students within your school population who are historically underrepresented, and making sure that we're implementing programming, we're creating policies and procedures that really work to address these student populations, because we know that when we're addressing these populations, we work to address all students. So while these statistics may be alarming, you'll learn through this presentation kind of key action steps you can take if you observe a youth that is experiencing distress. And some additional data. So this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and it's conducted on a biannual basis for high school students. It's a little less common in the middle school population, which is why we pulled out information for LA middle school students, which would be most comparable to the data that's available. So 12% of LA middle school students had reported making a suicide attempt compared to the national average of 9% of high school students. And kind of this tracks with suicidal ideation. So 27% of LA middle school students reported seriously thinking about suicide compared to the national average of 19% of high school students. So this is why it's really integral that we're learning how to support students in distress at a younger age, because we know that suicide has been increasing over the past few decades for youth. And then specifically around COVID-19, about 69% of 12 to 17-year-olds perceived that the pandemic negatively affected their mental health. And between 2019 and 2020, there was over a 30% increase in emergency room visits for mental health reasons for that age group, 12 to 17. So there is a really big need, and it starts with schools. So would love to hear from you all of what have you noticed in students you work with since COVID-19? So what changes do you think about over the past few years related to mental health and in general to the way that they've been kind of interacting with you, interacting at school, their behaviors? More anxious, social anxiety, school avoidance, depression, anger, social skills, lack of coping skills, changes in social interactions, depression and anxiety. So this is definitely tracking with what we found for our national data as well. Let's hope with all events in society. Okay, and what is really interesting too is that a lot of us as adults have been experiencing this as well. We've been experiencing these changes in behavior, social anxiety, changes in the way that we interact. But what's really important to note is that these changes are happening to students at an integral time in their development and when they are building these skills. So the effects are much greater for students. So that's why we need to kind of talk about this and figure out how we can work with students to really support them. Thank you everyone for sharing. Continue writing in. So this, what you all have been saying, tracks with our cohort baseline data of top mental health concerns reported by school personnel. So depression, anxiety, loneliness, lack of progress academically. So students not being prepared when they matriculate to the next grade level. And I think this quote from one of our schools will really resonate based on what you all are saying. So one of our high schools says students feel like they've been under a constant umbrella of trauma for so long, and that there's no escape. There is a sense of students giving up on themselves and a self-defeatist attitude. So some additional kind of data around COVID-19. So we know that the past several years have been really monumental in just what's been happening within our world. So political climate, discrimination, economic uncertainty. Students have felt like there's a pressure to make up for lost learning time, and increased apathy for academics, which some of you noted in the chat, stuck in previous developmental age from before COVID-19, and a lot of that social anxiety that you all had been mentioning. So nervous to take social risks. And schools are reporting that students' grades are much lower than usual and that they don't seem to care about doing well like they previously had. And also students who said that they were once excited about school events are really hesitant because it's just something that they kind of lost the experience to, and that kind of goes along with the social anxiety. And then additional impacts, we see increased symptoms or severity of anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance use and misuse, fear of infection for self and loved ones, this really significant grief for people and opportunities of missing milestones and the lack of social connectedness. And like I said, us adults have likely felt these same effects of COVID-19, but youth do, but with the pandemic, it's interfering with their development and affecting their social connectedness, which is at a critical formative point in their lives. And so turning it over to a more positive lens, in what ways have students you work with shown resilience over the past few years? Showing up, showing care for others, eager to get back to school, willingness to develop relationships, to help, empathy, wanting to change the world, absolutely, advocating for themselves, pushing forward and following through on their own goals. Keep trying even when things get hard, asking for help, filling the bucket, applying the coping skills they were taught, exactly like we just talked about in the last presentation, improving attendance. Great, so as it's clearly evident that your students have shown resilience over the past few years during COVID, and it's really important to acknowledge that for students, to really help them understand that they've been able to deal with in such unprecedented times, and they can use these skills in the future when things get really challenging. Thank you all for sharing. So the reason why we talk about all of this is because improving identification of mental health need is really critical. So 1 in 5 students, like we talked about, will experience a mental health challenge during their school year. So we know that there's high rates of reported need, but access is pretty poor. So less than 50% receive needed care, more than 50% drop out of care or treatment. And these rates are even more concerning for those who are part of historically underrepresented populations. And it's, as you all know, mental health and academics are clearly linked. So if a student is struggling with their academics, they're not going to be able to show up very well in the classroom. They're going to have a harder time attending classes. And so that's why identification is really key. So when we identify early on, this leads to more effective intervention. And identification can drive effort and resources for grades, groups, and the whole community. So it really benefits all aspects of the student's well-being, and will really help throughout their adolescence. And asking about and identifying high levels of well-being is a strength-based component of identification, with strong programming and shared goals for the entire school community. So let's talk through some tangible action steps for supporting students in distress. So the first one is to make sure that your school is supporting students by using a multi-tiered systems of support approach. And we'll dive into that in a moment as well. And it's important to kind of trust your training, be able to identify students in distress and ensure other school staff know how to do the same, really utilizing a team approach and knowing that students spend the most time with teachers in their classrooms, and teachers are really at the forefront of being able to identify those signs and follow school protocol and come to their school counseling team to figure out next steps. And then the last one is to know and follow your school's protocol, know the existing policies and procedures to support these students. So MTSS, as I'm sure you are somewhat familiar with or you're very familiar with, is a framework that helps educators provide academic and behavioral strategies for students with various needs. So for myself with a public health background, I really, really love this because I think it's so important to focus on upstream prevention approaches. And this is exactly what MTSS is. So it takes a really proactive approach to identifying students with academic or behavioral needs. We know that early assessment and intervention for these students can help them catch up with their peers sooner. So you can see that tier 1 at the bottom, that is the majority of students. We're reaching them with universal activities. I know San Diego Unified has used Character Strong and SEL curriculum. Mental health literacy, positive school climate are examples of tier 1 interventions. Tier 2 is when students have been identified as requiring additional support. So this could mean group psychoeducational interventions for early signs of risk behavior. And then tier 3, kind of the smallest tier, is for those who require more intensive interventions. So this could be trauma-focused individual cognitive behavioral therapy and suicide-specific treatments. So we learned about earlier today, just coping skills, which is an example of tier 1 that we're really trying to reach our students with these important skills so they know how to regulate themselves, they know how to identify their emotions, so that they can build up those coping skills, those protective factors, which will keep their mental health strong so that they may not need tier 2 or tier 3 interventions in the future. So I'm sharing with you all California's MTSS framework, and then also San Diego Unified has an integrated multi-tiered systems of support website, and I have that linked later on. These are it's a compilation of really great resources that can be shared with families, can be used in the classrooms, can be given to teachers around social emotional learning. And so I would really encourage you to look at that and take what's useful for you. And another question I have for you all is, how prepared do you feel in responding to students in distress? So very prepared, somewhat prepared, not at all, or feel free to write in the chat if you have kind of a different answer. And then whenever that's ready, we can share the results with the group. And we have a comment in the chat. I'm more uncertain as to how to respond to adult stress. So a lot of what we're learning too is relevant for both students and adults. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's see. So we have a range. We have a lot, 75% who responded somewhat prepared. And then we have 20% very prepared. Okay, and then we have another comment, personally prepared but lacking resources. So we'll talk through some tangible resources as we go throughout this presentation. So thank you all for participating. So here's a broad overview of your role in supporting students in distress. And we'll kind of dive into these as we go on. So the first is to know how to recognize a young person in distress. I'm sure many of you have had training of identification of warning signs, and we'll talk about that as well. Know how to engage a student, what to say, how to follow up, and know your resources. So what's available to you within your community, within your school to support you, and know the limitations of your role and trust your training. And this is really relevant to the next one as well, is be mindful of your own mental health. Really know who else you can lean on your team, whether that's administration as well, and help students feel comfortable and confident in supporting each other. So we know the research shows that many young people, many youth will turn to their peers before turning to a trusted adult. And that's why tier 1 interventions such as mental health literacy, SEL programming is really important so that peers can kind of learn how to help each other and help themselves to a certain extent. Of course, knowing that going to a trusted adult is needed in certain situations. So that's kind of the importance of a gatekeeper trainings. And then as we kind of go into recognition of youth, what would you say is a tip for recognizing a youth at risk? And thank you, Leah, for sharing that. That is definitely something I've been hearing across the board with the schools across the country, that we've just concerns around not having sufficient support. So acknowledge what you're saying, and we'll kind of talk through that as well later on. So what would you say is a tip for recognizing a youth at risk? Any change in their behavior? And then we have grades drop, attendance drops, acts differently, uncharacteristic behavior, observing whether they are withdrawn, moody, lack of sleep, eating disorders, rebelling, refusal to participate. Okay, new friend group, attendance. Okay, stressful life events. Okay, great. So thank you all for sharing those. So let's go into what warning signs are, which will likely be familiar to you all. So we know that many people give clues that they're thinking about suicide. And you all just referenced that. So big changes in behavior. So is there a student that you know that has always been the class clown, really lively, and all of a sudden isn't really participating anymore, is starting to withdraw from their friends, their loved ones? Or maybe is there a student who has always been really quiet, who is starting to act out and is really out of character? And then there's anger. Do they become very irritable for no reason? Are they expressing hopelessness? And then we saw that sleeping more or less. Are they engaging in drugs or drinking? Talking about suicide. And we want to make sure that everyone in the school building knows how to recognize these students and respond accordingly. So even if someone makes a joke about suicide, which is pretty common at the middle school and high school level, we want to still follow up and let them know that it's not a joke, that many people do suffer from thoughts of suicide, and we still want to address those situations. So whether it's someone sending a text to their friend, whether it's social media, these are all points that we still want to follow up and can be used as an opportunity to educate. And then going into Jamie's story to kind of dive into risk factors. Would anyone like to volunteer to read Jamie's story? You can feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat or just simply unmute.
I could do it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Jason.
Jamie has always been a good student with a close-knit friend group. She has struggled with depression since her grandmother died last year, but managed to keep her grades up and stay on the track team while also helping take care of her younger sibling.
Thank you, Jason. So would love to hear from you all. What risk factors do you see in Jamie's story? You can write it in the chat. You can unmute yourself and we'll go over risk factors. Grief, yes. Loss of her grandmother. What else are you seeing in Jamie's story? Grief, depression, responsibilities, isolation. Okay. Thank you. So we see that there's depression. Jamie has been dealing with depression since her grandmother died. And really interesting, I get the same kind of responses when I do this training about responsibilities. At this point, we don't know enough about Jamie's story to know whether the responsibilities may be more of a protective factor or risk factor. If we had maybe a little bit more information, I could see it going both ways depending on her perception of the additional responsibilities. Is it giving Jamie a sense of purpose, or is it giving her a lot of overwhelming, stressful feelings, needing to deal with all of that and her personal struggles? So here are some variables that increase suicide risk: mental health disorders such as anxiety and depression, a death of a loved one or a pet as well, trauma, substance use, bullying, and those who identify as LGBTQ. Okay, so the next one, can I please have another volunteer who is willing to read this part of Jamie's story?
I'm happy. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Since last month, Jamie's track teammates say she never wants to hang out after practice, saying things like, "What's the point?" And none of that matters. Yesterday, her friends were surprised when she yelled at them to leave her alone. Today, Jamie's first period teacher caught her drinking alcohol from her water bottle.
Thank you, Dave. So what warning signs do you see in this part of Jamie's story? Feel free to unmute. You can write in the chat as well, and I'll keep an eye out. Apathy, isolating herself, alcohol abuse. Right, she no longer wants to hang out with her friends anymore. She is kind of withdrawing from her loved ones, change in personality, hopeless, drinking, especially at school. Yes, negative mindset, irritability. Exactly. So you all covered these perfectly. So yeah, changes in behavior. So she used to hang out with her friends all the time, and now she doesn't want to. A sense of hopelessness. So she's saying, what's the point? And none of that matters. And then she did something that was out of character. She yelled at them. So she is exhibiting anger. And then of course, drinking alcohol and bringing that to school. So we know that there's the sudden changes in behavior, irritability, and anger that's out of context. She's talking about suicide too, saying what's the point, and then all the hopelessness that you all recognized. And so let's move to protective factors. So this is the same first part of the story that we read before about Jamie. So what are things that may be protecting her from suicide risk? What are some of the good things going on in Jamie's story? Younger siblings counting on her. Engage with school and sports. Exactly. Success at school academically. Yes. So what we see in Jamie's story is that she has a close-knit friend group, and she's managed to keep her grades up. And then at this point, we know that at least she's close with her family. We don't have enough information to say whether that could be more of a risk factor or protective factor, but it's great that you all are thinking about that information as something that is helpful. So when we think about protective factors, these are variables that keep students healthy and safe. And school is one of the best places where students can feel a sense of connectedness. They can learn how to cope, and also having access to effective mental health care is a protective factor. So once we look at Jamie's story in its entirety, there are pieces of the story that if you were a counselor, coming from it through a counselor's lens, you would know part of it. So you would likely know that she struggled with depression. If you were a teacher, you would know how she's doing with her grades. If you were the coach on the track team, you would see the changes in behavior of her not wanting to hang out with her friends anymore. So all of these pieces are really important to know that it's everyone's responsibility to support students in general, and of course support students in distress, and really utilizing a team approach and collaborating with teachers and other school personnel to recognize students who may be struggling and respond accordingly. So when we think about supporting students, we want school personnel to know that they don't have to have all the answers. They can use trust their gut. If they think there's a problem, it's a good chance that there is. Like I mentioned before, use a team approach, know your backup resources, systems, and use them. So Leah just mentioned earlier on, just kind of not having enough supports. So really becoming familiar and advocating for your counseling staff. American School Counselor Association, the counselor ratio should be 1 counselor per 250. And this is kind of something that a lot of schools struggle with, and what we help schools kind of advocate for is really showing the data and making sure that they understand that there's students who need to be accounted for. And if concerned, always consult. So you can consult your administrators. If you have other counseling team members, if you have a school psych, these would be really important people to collaborate with. And then going into guidance for starting a conversation. So we want to make sure that teachers can do the same as well. But if you're concerned, it's helpful to find a quiet and private place to speak with the student and kind of protect their confidentiality as well. The single most helpful element of doing this is to explain specifically why you are speaking with them. So students can become a little bit defensive, which of course makes sense. There's a person who they perceive as being in a place of authority, kind of confronting them. And that's why when we speak with students, we want to mention a specific observation, saying something like, I've noticed that you haven't been participating in class much anymore and your grades have been dropping. So in Jamie's story, perhaps mentioning that she seems to no longer want to be seeing her friends anymore, which is different. And then expressing concern. So show you care by saying something like, I really care about you and would like to check in. How have you been doing lately? And I think what's relevant from the last coping skills presentation we listened in on was Dr. Paz was talking about that kids have a really good BS detector. So I know counselors and teachers have found it really beneficial to just acknowledge the discomfort and say, I can understand that this is really uncomfortable for you. It's uncomfortable for me as well. Can really help the student open up and feel like they have someone who's willing to listen to them. And then the third step is, be a really good listener, validate their feelings. Don't try to fix their problems. You don't need to have all the answers. And then 4 is to ask if they've been thinking about suicide. And this handout specifically is one that we created for teachers. So we recommend that if someone doesn't feel comfortable asking directly, bring the student to someone who can follow your school policies related to this. You can say something like, are you thinking about ending your life? And then, also just remember to kind of ask open-ended questions, which is why, we talk about expressing the concern and taking time to listen to them so that they can't simply brush it off, that you're really bringing tangible examples of why you're speaking with them and why you feel concerned. And then there's, of course, a lot of challenges in expressing this concern, that they may not believe there's a problem. There's a stigma associated to speaking about mental health, which may be making it more challenging. They may come from a family where it's not really culturally acceptable to talk about this. So we want to be as responsive to that as possible. They also may be worried that facing the problem will make it worse. They may not want their guardian or family members to know. And they may be worried about other consequences. I see this as being really relevant in the middle school population, with this lack of understanding of what's going to happen if I go to a school counselor. Am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to get kicked out of school? This is really common with some of the focus groups I've done with that age group. So, making sure that there's tier 1 universal programming that talks about help seeking, that teaches students about mental health literacy as well. And here's some research that we've done in the past few years about top reasons that prevent high school students from getting help with mental health issues. You can see that a lot of the top ones relate to mental health stigma. So there's embarrassment, there's fear of having their friends or family find out. And then there's also a lack of knowledge around not knowing if they have a mental health issue. And that's where mental health literacy is really important too. So I want you to keep this in mind when we discuss some do's and don'ts on the next slide. So I like this slide because it discusses the do's and don'ts from the perspective of a young person. And this is a vantage point that we often don't see. So some of the don'ts that are relevant to the previous slide around stigma are, treat them normally without judgment, use an understanding or empathetic tone, continue checking in and make yourself available. So don't necessarily come to a student one day and express your concerns and then never talk to them again. That really contributes to the stigma, is when we talk about it once and we never follow up. And then show that you care and you value them. And some of the don'ts, don't freak out or make light of the situation. A lot of students who have come to adults and teachers about their struggles, they hear a lot of, oh, it's going to get better. Oh, you're so young, don't worry about it. And this really makes young people feel worse. Feel like there's really something wrong with them, that they should be able to just get over it. And someone who is dealing with serious mental health conditions can't just do that. So making sure that as adults, we're not using an accusatory or condescending tone. Don't make them feel like a burden, or don't make it feel like it's about you. So I think this slide is really helpful in kind of bringing in that voice of students that we often don't hear. And then some other challenges, if someone is not obviously or immediately in harm's way and won't accept your help, try to keep the lines of communication open. Check in with other professional staff or other support options. And as we mentioned, continue to follow up. If we know that someone is having an emergency and refuses help, call 988, and then make sure to review your district or your individual school's policy for exact guidance. And there's often a misconception that when we ask about suicide, we're putting the idea into someone's head. And this is a really, really common misconception that makes it really hard to collaborate with teachers at times. We want everyone to understand that asking about suicide is not going to put the idea into someone's head. Instead, it lets them know you see their pain and you are there to help. And this has been backed by research. And we can say things more indirectly or directly, such as, do you wish you would go to sleep and not wake up? Have you had thoughts about killing yourself? Do you wish you were dead? Have you had thoughts about suicide? And one thing when I ask for examples of how to ask if a youth is thinking about suicide is a suggestion of, have you thought about hurting yourself? But we do not recommend saying that, because there's a difference between someone who is using self-injury as a coping skill, so that's non-suicidal self-injury, versus someone who is suicidal. So we really want to focus on those direct questions about suicide. And then would be really interested to hear from you all, and what is your school's policy for managing suicidal crises? And you can just take kind of one snippet or one thing that you think would be relevant to share to this conversation of just making sure you all are aware of your school's policy. And then we can go into kind of some general guidance. Okay, yep. So there's a document, never leave the student unattended. Yes, I'm familiar with that procedure document. Call 911. Okay, great. So it sounds like you all are, familiar. Notify admin, contact parents. So the general guidance that we provide is to take the student seriously, calmly get the information you need to get them help. We just saw it in the chat. Do not leave the student alone. A responsible adult should always be present, making sure to document the incident. And then I'm pretty sure that EP10 procedure has information on caregiver, guardian notification, and follow-up services. And then kind of the last step is just a reminder to understand the resources that are available to you. So this would be any administrative support resources, school, organization, those types of protocols for responding to mental health problems, substance misuse, harassment, bullying, and knowing these emergency protocols as well. And then knowing what crisis hotlines are available. So there's the crisis text line and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which just released its 3-digit number. And making sure that these resources are available to students. A lot of schools will put this information, distribute it on student ID card, or have it in classrooms as a reminder that help was always available. And then I just put a link on there for the website that I was mentioning earlier. And then here are some specific JED resources. These will also be shared with you. We have a mental health resource center for teens and young adults, a COVID-19 resource center, Seize the Awkward, which is a campaign around encouraging youth to talk about mental health with their friends. And then a parent conversation guide. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening to me today, and I'll open it up to any questions you have, and I'll also add my email to the chat. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all so much for participating via the chat. It was really helpful to hear from you all.
Thank you so much, Leah. Anyone have questions while we have her with us? And feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask directly if you'd like.
I have a question. Hi, I'm Danielle Adams, my elementary. My question is, can I share that slide just now and do a direct presentation with my teachers with the information that you just gave us myself?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, definitely. So once that's shared with you, you can feel free to do so. And then if you have any questions, just let me know. In that resources page, there's a lot of different handouts and materials that can be distributed as well to your other colleagues and staff.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Any other questions or comments or takeaways, reflections?
And I just want to note also that, the work that we're doing with your district, it's meant to have kind of findings in elementary and middle school. So what we're doing is gathering a lot of data from what the district has been doing, reviewing policies and procedures. And last spring, we had 3 focus groups with one with students, one with families, and one with school staff as well. So we're kind of compiling all these resources, understanding the areas of opportunities and areas of strength to really help bolster the mental health supports for students. So we're really kind of excited about continuing this partnership over the next 3 years with San Diego Unified.
Yeah, I'd like to say something. Thanks, Leah. Obviously, last year, our EP10s, or suicidal alerts, increased immensely at our school, Northwest High School. So this is timing-wise perfect. Also, what 5 high schools will you be supporting this year?
So we are working with Canyon Hills, Lincoln, Patrick Henry, Crawford, and Claremont.
Great, thanks.
Of course, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, Leah. I in particular loved the do and don't slide about interacting with students around suicide, and I'm eager to look through all of the resources that we'll get with the slides that are sent out. So we appreciate you being here today. All right, I would like to give a quick shout out to some of our Rady team who've worked so hard behind the scenes to make today happen. We have our business analyst, Sochi Reed, project coordinator, Brenna Hill, Dr. Desiree Shapiro, and our senior director, Dominique Hensler. Rady team, if you're available, please give a wave. If you're not, I know some of you are multitasking, so not a problem. This amazing team has also arranged for goodie bags to be delivered to each of you who are spending time with us today, and you should receive those bags over the next week. So we will now take a short 5-minute break, an actual break that you can go ahead and refill your coffee, hydrate yourself, stretch, walk outside for a breath of fresh air. There will be a timer that pops up on the screen, so just keep an eye on that timer and rejoin us in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I had a Zoom issue right as the break was. I think my computer needed a break to refresh as well. So thank you for confirming. So I hope you're all enjoying your time with us today. I think we've had some wonderful information shared and we're excited for the home stretch. Before we have our next speaker though, we're gonna have another mindfulness exercise. So our next mindfulness practice is from the 0 to 3 mindfulness toolkit that is focused on internal awareness. And I will share a link in the chat to that toolkit so that you all have that to refer to. There's a wealth of great information there. But I'll start off with a quote by the late Dr. Jerry Powell. She's a professor, teacher, trainer, writer, and early childhood advocate. And the quote is, "How you are is as important as what you do." So the quote conveys the understanding that the quality of our presence with others is important. How we're doing internally impacts our ability to be open and present with the students and families that we serve. In order to effectively work with students, with your colleagues, it's helpful to have a clear sense of how you're doing in the moment. So this practice is intended to help us tune in with ourselves. Again, as you listen and consider what I'm sharing, please feel free, even though we asked you to turn cameras back on after the break, please feel free to turn your cameras off so that you can have some time to yourself here while you're listening. And either sitting or standing, take an intentional posture that is relaxed and upright. Allow your posture to express a sense of being present, at ease, and awake. Soften your gaze or close your eyes if that's more comfortable for you. And take a few deep breaths as you did in our first exercise, and slowly exhale. Focusing your attention on physical sensations in your body. What do you notice? Are there any areas of tension or discomfort? What parts of your body feel relaxed and at ease? Can you sense areas that feel alive with energy or areas that feel dull or numb? Over the next several moments, notice how these sensations may change as you give them your attention. Now bringing your attention to your mind. Notice either how active or settled your mind is right now. Can you notice thoughts as they pass through? Is your mind holding on to any particular thoughts, or is it calm and quiet? Thoughts will always arise, that's natural. But see if you can observe these thoughts come and go without getting attached or caught up in them. Now bringing your awareness to your emotions, notice the predominant feeling you have in this moment. Can you label that emotion? What other emotions are present? Are these feelings positive? Are they negative? Or are they neutral? Try to just notice your emotions without judging or analyzing them. Can you just be present to what you're feeling right now in this moment? Notice for a moment how all of these factors that make up your physical, your mental, and your emotional states are working together right now. They're influencing each other, and they're creating how you are in this moment. And as best you can, bring a sense of acceptance and kindness and compassion to how you're doing right now without judging yourself. We download our calm, so to speak, into the children and families we serve. And when we're well, we can give our best to them. So with that mindset, let's join back together. Cameras on if you prefer, and let's shift into our final segment. And Sochi, we are good, right?
Correct.
Oh, I did see that. Thank you. All right, we are honored to have our final speaker, an instructor at Harvard Medical School, here to speak about social media and mental health for students. Dr. Meredith Gassner is a child psychiatrist at Cambridge Health Alliance. And again, as with all of our guests, her full bio is available in your workshop materials. Dr. Gassner, thank you so much for your time today, and I now give you the virtual floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a second, please. All right, hopefully, can everyone see?
Perfect.
Good, awesome. It's always really embarrassing doing research in technology use and sometimes having moments where I worry I don't know how to use technology when you're on the spot. So thank you all for your patience. Today I'm going to be talking about the vast world of social media and its influence on child and adolescent lives. In terms of disclosures, I don't have any conflicts of interest related to the content that I'm going to present on, but I should mention that my research specifically, not other research that I'll be presenting, was funded by Harvard Medical School's DuPont Warren Fellowship and Livingston Award. Today's objectives, the first, to understand the multitudes of ways that youth interact with and use social media, and that includes both the amount of use and type of use, as well as the sort of normative use of social media, how youth use it to prompt normal adolescent development. So that's the first part. The second, to then understand the major categories of high-risk social media use. And then lastly, to become familiar with strategies that can help prevent and intervene upon high-risk social media use. So first, how do youth use digital media? I'm going to start with tweens and teens because since this is about social media specifically, tweens and teens remain the most common users of social media. Really, under the age of 8, kids don't tend to use social media for connection to others. In terms of what is being watched, tweens, the ages of 8 to 12, typically watch mostly television and videos through social media, less of the connecting to others, and they spend about an estimate of under 5 hours per day using screens. And then teens, unsurprisingly, use about twice that, with more recent estimates suggesting they use up to 9 hours a day of screens. Interestingly, the statistic for the amount of teenagers that have their own smartphones, which is prompting that 9 hours of use, is that 95% of teenagers have smartphones, and that hasn't changed over the last several years, despite the pandemic. So that's remained consistent from back in 2019 up until now. The largest percentage of use remains passive video watching. So, by and large, overall, all kids are using screens just to watch things passively. But we know that teenagers are the age group that are far more likely to engage in the connection aspect, the social media aspect of connecting to others and talking to others online. 45% of teenagers say that they are online constantly, and that includes at night when they're supposed to be sleeping. And about a third say that they are using social media platforms constantly. The graph in the middle is hot off the press from Pew Research Center, summer 2022, and it's showing the changes of usage over time of some of the more popular platforms. And it really shouldn't be surprising for probably most people watching this who know children that certain things like Facebook, Gen Xers and millennials are really the only people keeping that one alive still. Teenagers don't use Facebook at all anymore. Twitter has declined in popularity, same with Tumblr. But things like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat have skyrocketed and are still increasing. And YouTube, despite TikTok, remains the most popular platform with a 95% of teenagers reporting that they're active YouTube users. Now, I know I'm speaking to counselors who see the range from elementary school all the way up through high school. And so I don't want people who see elementary school kids to think, oh my gosh, no part of this talk is relevant to me and I should just leave and go get coffee. You could do that. But I just want to mention, kids under the age of 8, even though they aren't using social media necessarily to connect to others the way that teenagers are, they still have access. Estimated about ages 0 through 8, 2 hours per day are spent on screen media, and 40 minutes of that is on mobile devices. And I think that's really critical because it means that there is a large chunk of time which kids under the age of 8 may be on devices, unmonitored, their own potential personal devices. As you can see in the graph on the right here, from 2011 to 2017, there was a big jump in kind of personal ownership in the age group 0 to 8 years old of personal tablet ownership. So there are kids who have their own tablets, who are watching multitude of social media platforms, watching YouTube videos, who are in fact exposing themselves to a lot of the risks that are inherent with social media use that the teenagers and tweens may encounter more frequently. So it's really critical for all of us that work with children of any age group to just be aware of what is out there on all social media platforms, because even if they might not be using social media quite in the same way as their older peers, they are still seeing what may be there and the content that may be there that can be incredibly risky. That is my daughter, who is actually now in elementary school in the center. So what is the normal role of social media in adolescent development? How do adolescents use social media to help to build upon themselves in ways that we consider instrumental to adolescence? So building their identity and building their relationships and figuring out who they are. Unsurprisingly, social media's biggest boon for them is connection. Those who say that social media has been an incredibly positive thing for them really cite that it's because they're able to connect with their friends and their family using social media platforms. This is super important because when social media platforms first took off a decade-ish ago, a little more than that now, there was a lot of concern among really everybody, but a lot of researchers saying, oh my gosh, what if people no longer communicate face-to-face? And we have youth just sitting and staring at their phones and ignoring each other, and there are no more in-person friendships. And luckily, that was somewhat of a catastrophic, I can't even say that, catastrophizing, because that is not actually how it turned out, right? By and large, kids use social media as a way to connect and strengthen the relationships that they already have in person. That really is primarily for kids who are maybe more neurotypical or don't struggle as much with social connectedness. They really have existing friendships that they build upon using social media platforms. And unsurprisingly, exploring one's gender and sexuality online is also a really important role of social media. That's a huge developmental milestone in adolescence in general. And unfortunately, in many areas of this country, right, it's an area that teens may not feel open to even explore within themselves the idea that they might identify as a different gender or multiple genders, or identify as a sexuality that's not accepted within their local community. And so there has been a lot of research that's looked at how youth who don't identify as the traditional cisgender heterosexual youth can really start exploring what else they might identify as and maybe feel more at home in the communities online. So really important milestone within adolescent development. Health, another area where I think maybe the older ones of us don't consider the digital world to be how we learn about health, but youth are increasingly using platforms, social media platforms, to understand, much to my chagrin as a physician, understand their health concerns and understand their diagnoses. And so for them, they use it both to kind of boost their mental health when they're struggling, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a few slides, but also to join groups related to health and wellness, to learn about diagnosis, to learn about treatments. That's a really important thing for social media platforms for teens these days. And this is particularly true for youth who suffer from psychiatric symptoms, from depression. They've been found to be far more likely to want to use digital means to connect with their healthcare providers, to learn about their diagnosis, to learn about potential treatments, and want to connect with others who might share some of the same symptoms and diagnoses. particularly for rare conditions, rare illnesses where you may get an illness where you can't go outside and be around others. You may not be able to engage in the typical adolescent milestones. Social media can provide groups and forums that allows teens to connect to others who are suffering from a similar illness. And that can be incredibly helpful for them to kind of build upon a social network that they otherwise wouldn't have had access to. And then it can also potentially even impact treatment outcomes in certain illnesses. Some research has looked at the role of specific groups related to illnesses, rare illnesses, and how just being part of a group with others who are sharing the same struggles and illness can be helpful in treatment. And then identity. As I mentioned earlier, identity is a major milestone in adolescent development. Adolescents are really trying to figure out, who am I and what do I care about and what is important to me? And youth do cite social media platforms as a way to help them figure out how they feel about really important issues. And I think you can see that predominantly within a lot of the activism that has happened over the last decade, from the Arab Spring to March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, and the School Strike for Climate. Two of these in particular, March for Our Lives and School Strike for Climate, are really student-led movements that went national because of social media platforms. Social media platforms are really, how these movements took off and went across the nation and potentially, across the world. So social media platforms have really allowed teenagers to take advantage of sort of an activism mindset and start figuring out, what is important to me and how am I going to fight for it and care about it. So there's a lot of good that social media can provide, and there's a lot of ways in which social media can help to bolster the normal adolescent developmental milestones, figuring out their identity and figuring out how they can individuate from their parents. But the last 2 years, right, unsurprisingly, there was this thing called the coronavirus pandemic, which did significantly limit the amount of things that teenagers could involve themselves in, which would normally help them develop in kind of a healthy way and develop their identity, right? So things like hobbies, school, family, extracurricular activities, milestone events, social media now, and socializing with friends, are all things that adolescents traditionally use to sort of help move through adolescence and figure out who they are. And media use notably did change over the pandemic. I do a lot of my research is app-based. So I do app-based research looking at youth with mental health issues and investigating both kind of a problematic media habits as well as mental health outcomes. And we saw over the course of the pandemic, tracking kids every day in their media use, that there was a significant jump in their mean social media use from pre-COVID-19 to kind of COVID-19. I originally said post-COVID-19, but it's not like there's really post start of the pandemic as it's still going on. So media use did change significantly during the pandemic. Social media use shot up. And that by and large is because, as I said, all these things started to disappear and you're sort of left with social media. And I actually included partly hobbies because I realized some people's hobbies actually maybe were indoors or they were able to continue those during the pandemic. So you had all these factors that teens could use to help them figure out who they were and to individuate and to form relationships. And then you're sort of left with social media and, maybe a few indoor hobbies. And I'll talk a lot more a little bit later on about some of the other potential consequences of that. So risks of social media use. This I find gets longer and more heavy every time I present on this because the risks unfortunately don't seem to stop. There are two major categories of risky use. There's sort of an overuse or dependency, which some people consider like addiction. I tend to not use that terminology, but certainly there are many researchers that do. And then there's also, high risk encounters. So maybe people that don't find themselves dependent upon social media use and can separate from it. But when they do go on, right, they do things that are incredibly risky. And I've made this as two overlapping circles because this should be surprising to no one. People who spend more time online are inherently going to be at risk of those high risk encounters as well, just by virtue of them spending more time online. And certainly, I think sometimes the same types of people tend to be both more predisposed to developing overuse and engaging in high risk social media encounters. So first to talk about social media overuse. As I mentioned, a lot of researchers sometimes hypothesize that there may be components of social media overuse that are very addiction-like, even though we can't really fully say with confidence that social media is, an addiction, as we would qualify perhaps an addiction of another substance, for example. But they were able to sort of clarify that social media overuse has components that do reflect addictions, like, for example, salience, tolerance, the use to modify mood, relapse, withdrawal, and consequences outside of social situations, inside of work, consequences to your personal life, things like that. Those are all important parts that make an addiction and that can potentially also be applicable to social media overuse. One of these scales that can be used to screen for social media addiction is the Bergen Social Media Addiction Scale. And they basically take those 6 categories and create 6 questions based upon those categories that I mentioned before that sort of are necessary in order to qualify for having an addiction. And it rates from 1 to 5, 5 being, very often you have this behavior, and 1 very rarely. And the cutoff point is 19 for high risk use. And so, the first part, salience, you spend a lot of time thinking about social media. It's one of the only things you think about. 2, you have an urge to use social media more and more, right? So that's tolerance. You have to keep engaging in social media to get the same sort of comfort or pleasure from using it. The third, you use social media in order to forget about personal problems or maybe to alter your mood. So that's the mood modification. And then, fourthly, you try to cut down on the use of social media, but don't have success. That's the relapse component. 5, you become restless or troubled if you're prohibited from using social media. So that's you're having withdrawal symptoms from not using. And then lastly, the consequences, right? It's having a negative impact on your job or studies. I won't ask that any of you go through this yourselves for social media. I know I've woefully gone through this similar scales for kind of overall internet use. It's a little alarming sometimes, but this is a great way to kind of get a sense from youth of how much they feel like social media is kind of influencing their lives in ways that may not be healthy. And in terms of social media overuse, right, we know what it is, what's entailed in social media overuse, but how does it develop? Where does it come from? So as I mentioned, a lot of the studies that I do are using a phone app to track behavior and phone use and also symptoms. And I specifically have looked at something called problematic internet use, which basically is social media overuse plus all other types of internet overuse, and getting a sense of how that manifests in kids who are struggling with things like depression and anxiety. And being able to track kids every day and their mood habits and their media habits has really allowed us to get some pretty granular information about how their mood changes dependent on their use of the internet. And so we can actually see with our studies that anxiety improves in the short term after they have increased kind of dependency on digital media. So those times when they feel like they are less able to draw themselves away, they actually report decreased anxiety overall and improvements in their anxiety scales. And we can actually look at their phone use and see how much they are engaging, like unlocking their phones. We can see how long their phone sessions are. And in doing that, we can actually see that they're saying they're less depressed on the days that they are actually more engaged with their phones and using their phones more. So there is some evidence from our studies that, in fact, social media is used as a coping skill for a lot of these kids, and that actually may improve mood symptoms in the short term, which contradicts pretty significantly with a lot of the research out there that says, overall, over a long period of time, the kids that spend the most time on devices and on social media have worse mental health outcomes. So how do we account for that contradiction? I think this graph, as crude as it is, kind of summarizes what we're seeing here, right? The kids that only go to social media to fix their feelings, to fix how they're coping with things, that is where these problems come in, because these are the kids that are spending hours and hours a day online and unfortunately getting stuck in this vicious cycle that you see here, right? So a kid may feel really anxious, may feel depressed, they go and use social media, they're like, this feels better, I feel better. And then unfortunately, the longer they use social media for, they're going to encounter some of the risky things I'm going to talk about very shortly. And then they feel worse. And instead of maybe turning to a different coping skill and saying, hey, I should probably disconnect from my device for a bit, they say, well, maybe if I go to a different platform, or maybe if I watch some videos. And I mean, I love cat videos as much as anybody, right? But the more you go back on social media, the more you risk encountering things that may be triggering or problematic and worsen those mood symptoms. And so then again, you get stuck in this cycle. And COVID-19, I think, changed that pretty dramatically for a lot of youth, because youth that prior to the pandemic had multitudes of coping skills, right? They might have been on the football team, or they might have been part of like an orchestra or plays, or just hung out with their friends after school. Depending on what community you were a part of, COVID-19 completely changed that. And so I think a lot of what we've been seeing with kids' mental health worsening significantly is because there was suddenly this abrupt cutoff of coping skills, and a lot of kids ended up turning to social media as a way to help modify their mood and cope with an incredibly challenging and difficult time. And I can say I do outpatient work now, but I did inpatient work during the pandemic, right when it started. And a lot, I would say probably the vast majority of the kids that I saw coming in came in, and not necessarily because of depression that was caused by social media, right? But because of something that had happened online, because they were using social media in an unmonitored way to try to modify their mood. And as I mentioned, I studied problematic internet use. I looked at actual problematic internet use and internet dependency during the pandemic, and we did found that significantly increased in our patients during the COVID pandemic. And that has been replicated in multiple international studies as well. So more specifically, higher risk influences of social media. These are the higher risk encounters that I was talking about earlier. I apologize, we're gonna go through these pretty fast because there are a lot of them. So one of them is body image. It's probably no surprise to many of you that kids, when they're on social media, are very attuned to how other people are presenting themselves, and therefore can also be very vulnerable to how they perceive themselves. This has flared up particularly in the eating disorder community, where once social networks took off, the eating disorder social communities came very, very shortly after. There have been longstanding pro-eating disorder communities on social media platforms, from Reddit and now all the way to TikTok, which is struggling with the same problem. We found that those communities over time are almost impossible to ban because they are very good at finding ways to circumvent the monitoring that happens and the banning that happens, and they'll just change their names, add a letter, and so they can kind of get by any sort of the monitoring and banning that occurs. And also just because they can spread from platform to platform, right? So the more social media platforms we have, the more they can jump from one platform. Maybe if they're not having as much success evading censorship on that platform, they can just jump to a new platform, as we're seeing now the tremendous amount of eating disorder videos on TikTok. And not only with kids who are struggling with eating disorder issues, but just in general, how kids perceive themselves online. This, I think, was an incredible photo series that was done where this photographer asked youth to basically take photos of themselves and to then alter them to the point where they're like social media ready through filters. And you can see that they felt that they had to significantly alter their appearances in order to feel like they were ready to present themselves online. And really giving, I think, kids the sense that they have to appear a certain way in order to show who they are online. And what's even more frightening is that this kind of Snapchat dysmorphia has also then led to individuals seeking out surgical modifications of themselves to look more like how they would like to look with filters on their selfies. So I think, unfortunately, social media is also, for youth that are struggling with self-esteem, really can influence them in a negative way in terms of kind of understanding how one should look and how to accept themselves and how they look normally. Okay, next issue. I'm starting with a case vignette. So the mom of a 17-year-old female student with a history of depression and cutting, stating that she's incredibly worried that her daughter has been injuring by headbanging, or self-injuring by headbanging. Her daughter says that she just accidentally walked into a wall, which mom does not believe. The daughter refuses to talk anymore about how she might have walked into a wall. So I'm just going to give you guys a few seconds to think about why a teenager might have walked into a wall. And I want to take a sip of water. It's a strategic case vignette. So Bird Box is actually the answer to that. I don't know if anyone is even still watching this film. It was a Sandra Bullock Netflix film about you, I guess, like, you needed to blindfold yourselves essentially to survive an alien invasion. And so lo and behold, lots of people decided to blindfold themselves in the real world to decide whether or not that was in fact possible. And unfortunately, this teen in Utah blindfolded herself while driving, which we all know was a terrible, terrible idea. And unfortunately, the Bird Box challenge was not, an isolated online challenge. Online challenges are really sometimes terrifying, sometimes not so. I think it's also really important to mention that dares clearly are not new, right? Like all of us have probably engaged in dares with our friends and truth or dare. That is kind of something that is central to many people's childhoods. I think what is different about online challenges is that you actually can find a way to almost quantify your success in terms of your ability to engage in challenges, right? So it can offer somebody who's struggling with self-esteem issues notoriety and attention. And through the number of likes and people sharing their videos and retweets and reposts, you can actually get the sense of like, wow, look how many people, this felt great. Like people are watching me. And there are all these other challenges out there. Let's do it again. And lo and behold, there are tons of other challenges out there. There's the Kylie Jenner lip challenge, cinnamon challenge, blackout challenge, Tide Pod challenge. I mean, these are all challenges that youth have engaged in. And unfortunately, as we've been seeing more recently, there have been many news stories about the blackout challenge, for example, and how some people have actually been dying based on the blackout challenge, which kind of cropped up on TikTok as TikTok has taken off as a social media platform. And clearly not all youth are going to be engaging in these challenges, right? But it's the kids that are struggling, the kids that struggle with executive functioning and self-esteem that are going to be drawn to these challenges. And lo and behold, we surveyed a bunch of psychiatrically hospitalized youth about 4 years ago, and nearly a quarter of them said that they regularly engaged in these online challenges. So those are the kids that seem to be taking to these challenges as a way to make themselves feel better. Maladaptive coping skills is another big area where social media platforms have been in, I guess, mixed influence, as this researcher, Stephen P. Lewis, has done a lot of studies looking at, his words, not mine, the double-edged nature of self-injury online and self-injury videos specifically online. So his studies have really kind of intensely looked at cutting videos and basically tried to parse out and to what sense is this helpful? And it is in fact helpful because it can encourage recovery. It can offer kids a place to go to if they want advice on different coping skills, but it also can potentially perpetuate the behavior and influence the behavior further, or it could trigger a youth that was otherwise maybe doing okay and had been able to use different coping skills. It may trigger them to re-engage in cutting. And what's unfortunate is that it's not like one child can see these videos and whenever they do, they're triggered, right? It's one child that may at some points be helped by these videos, and parents may be like, great, this is a really great thing for them. But at another point, maybe when they're feeling lower or something has happened, these videos may be incredibly triggering. So it's both sides of the coin to one particular individual. And I think, I didn't mention here, but it was also notable is that, they found that unfortunately, the more graphic sometimes these videos are, that actually tends to get the most attention. And so for some youth, that could be is actually a pretty incentivizing reason to engage in more dangerous cutting behaviors, because the more graphic the video, the more intense the injury, the more likes they might get, the more comments they might get. And so unfortunately, that's kind of another way that it can influence and fuel the behavior further. Cyberbullying, another major area of social media woes, not at all rare, estimated 23% prevalence, highly correlative with depression, much like in-person bullying. But in contrast to in-person bullying, there does seem to be increased risk of suicide and suicide attempts compared to in-person traditional bullying. I think this is largely because cyberbullying can be a little bit more insidious than traditional in-person bullying, right? So, in-person bullying, you can physically distance yourself from that person. You may be able to go home and escape that. But with social media bullying, there is no escape. You might want to go online to try and make yourself feel better. You may then again be the victim of cyberbullying. So it makes it that much harder to escape. It also can be done sort of quietly, such that people who are close to you might not realize that that's actually going on. So parents frequently don't realize that their kids are being cyberbullied. Teachers might not realize it, and the school could be completely in the dark that this is happening until it's later brought to their attention. And so you end up having youth where it's a quite toxic form of bullying that's sort of invading their life. And they, also might be saying, okay, but is this even bullying? And I think what's really important to note is cyberbullying, we all say, oh, it's bullying, obviously, right? Like, you're being cyberbullied. But I think we're finding more and more the case with teenagers and sometimes even with adults that it might not always be apparent when one is being hurt or victimized online. And that's in part because intent is really hard to determine when one is online, and you don't get tone and you don't necessarily get the facial expressions of another person to say, okay, maybe that person clearly doesn't like me right now, and I'm definitely getting that they are trying to insult me. And I think it's much easier with cyberbullying for it to go on for longer because the youth may just simply not really understand that they are being bullied. And that particularly includes cases of intimate partner violence, where they're in a relationship with somebody and that person might be constantly texting them, constantly liking all their social media posts, constantly monitoring their social media posts, right? In a way that seems like it should be affectionate and loving, but is actually quite toxic and putting an extreme power differential, which is considered one of the critical elements for it to be cyberbullying. So I think those are all ways where cyberbullying can be far more, I think, powerful and dangerous than traditional in-person bullying. Self-diagnosis, this is something that has taken off in the last year specifically, or 2 years specifically. I've seen it most in the last year, where kids are trying, I guess, turning to social media platforms to kind of identify with particular diagnoses or diagnosing themselves online. This, I think, is particularly bad now because, again, kids suddenly lost a lot of their community during the pandemic, and this offers them a chance to have that identity and have that community in a way that they might not have been able to have access to because of the pandemic. And not only are we seeing people self-diagnose, but we're actually also seeing people pick up the other symptoms that they might not actually have. So we're seeing like mass sociogenic illness of things like tics, like TikTok tics, which is kind of fun to say. And that's sort of what this author is referred to as the horoscope effect, where basically you see something that should apply to you and you say like, hey, like, if this, like, I'm a Taurus, so it's like, hey, I'm learning about what should happen to me as a Taurus within the next month. And I really think this does actually apply to me and my life. And you kind of start acting accordingly. And so we're seeing a lot of youth who are picking up these behaviors and these symptoms of these diagnoses in a way that isn't necessarily real. Secondary trauma and online racism, very, very important for all youth of color and ethnic minorities. We really need to always be considering that youth of color are far more at risk when they go online than, you know, any other youth. It's in so many different ways, right? So like first and foremost, secondary trauma. If you're going online and constantly seeing references to, you know, racial persecution, horrendous events where, you know, the George Floyd murdered, where people are being killed because of their race, these mass shootings that can be racially motivated, that alone is enough to create PTSD symptoms. And a lot of authors of color have been writing about how dangerous it can actually be for youth to go online these days because of just having to see that trauma over and over and over again. And then on top of that, right, you not only have to see those news articles, but you also apparently can have sorry, for whatever reason that is, there we go. You also are having these youth encounter racism both vicariously and directly through these social media platforms. And that goes, you know, through all social media platforms. So it's not rare, you know, almost 95% of minority youth say that they experienced indirect racial discrimination. So that's like seeing negative things about their race posted online. And almost 80% said that they had experienced racial discrimination directly as an individual. So it's always really important that, you know, we check in, especially during times where there have been, you know, recent spates in the news of horrendous violence against a particular ethnic minority, that we check in with our youth of color and say like, hey, how are you doing? And recognize that like their coping mechanisms may be more limited, because if they would traditionally otherwise go on social media, right, to make themselves feel better, that isn't a safe space for them necessarily. Sort of tied to that, extremism and violence, unfortunately, is also a major risk factor in social media use. We've done many studies looking at violence overall and in terms of social media networks of violence, and have found that both on the local level and the national level, extremist ideology and violence actually spreads like a virus. It is very infectious and contagious. And so there's this very contagious kind of thought process that's out there, as well as a really sort of enticing, unfortunately, avenue for youth to find an identity that they may otherwise not be a part of, find a community that, you know, maybe something that their family and friends aren't approving of, but it's one that can sort of silo them and make them feel important, make them feel as though their rights are being entrenched upon, make them feel as though they have to fight now and do something violent now, because otherwise something horrible might happen to them. Their life is in danger, right? And it can even offer the chance to role play as, feel like they're an important person of power and give them that power. And so social media has really been a frightening way that extremist groups have been able to get youth to start to identify with more extremist viewpoints and even potentially engage in violence. Suicide contagion, we've long known that suicide depictions through any sort of form of media it's contagious, and it can then encourage copycat suicides. And one more recent study actually looked specifically at social media cluster that posted a lot about recent suicides in Ohio, and found that unfortunately those youth that did visualize suicidal kind of content or even discussion of suicide on these social media platforms were actually more likely to have SI and suicide attempts than if they hadn't viewed that content. And that was more pronounced in youth that didn't have any prior history of suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, which is particularly notable. And I include 13 Reasons Why here because the authors not only looked at the social media platforms kind of surrounding the suicide cluster that occurred in Ohio, but they also took into account the potential impacts of visualizing media portrayals of suicide, like the graphic suicide scene that was in the first season of 13 Reasons Why, and found that all those things combined could be kind of potentially a really deadly situation for many youth. And then lastly, relationships and sexting. A lot of researchers have, I think, correctly argued that one should sometimes can be considered that sexuality is sort of adapting to the online world, right? So like normative development, adult development is to kind of explore one's sexuality and sexual urges. And basically the digital world is a new way to do that. I think that's true, but obviously anything digital is going to come with additional risks, right? So like if you're going to be engaging and sending any sort of images of yourself from a sexual explicit images, you want to recognize that unwanted exposures are at increased risk if you're doing that online, right? If you are also sending it to somebody, that could then go to more people that you did not intend to send to. We've seen in the news, and I've seen personally in inpatient work, an increase in kids who've been extorted or blackmailed because they have sent images to people that they thought were their teenagers, but ended up turning out to be adults that were blackmailing them for money in order to not get those images spread. Additionally, you've probably all heard that child pornography is a potential, being charged with child pornography is a potential risk when one is sexting. That is still a very real risk, although I will say that prosecutions in actuality are fairly rare, but it's still something to consider when a youth is considering engaging in sexting. And then also, we know that youth with developmental and intellectual disabilities are at particular risk of sometimes understanding how digital exploration of one's sexuality and sexual behaviors is riskier. So I've seen a lot of kids on the spectrum or with developmental delays that will use digital media as a way to explore their sexuality, but in ways that can be incredibly unsafe. So very important to screen those populations in particular. So all that said, all those risks, how do we address this problem? Well, there's prevention and there's intervention. In terms of prevention, it should start as early as possible. There is some great resources on Common Sense Media. I don't know how many of you have been on that site. I love this site. Well, they actually will provide like lessons and resources to teach digital literacy to kids based on grade level. So they have resources for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, what have you. And so you really want to focus on the basics as early as possible. Why it's important to limit your screen time, how you can keep safe if you need to separate from digital media and maybe it doesn't feel good inside, learning what it feels like inside when you have to separate from digital media. I know, unfortunately, my 6-year-old could probably benefit from that sort of learning at school. Digital safety, what information should you share online? What information should you not share online? And then digital citizenship, right? How do you treat others online? And what do you do if you see something that is scary online or someone else is being mean to another person online? What do you do? Who do you tell? And so those are all important questions that we need to start teaching our kids from a very early age as soon as they're on devices. And for the older kids, tweens and teens, a lot of the K-5 learning is still relevant. right? So like it just kind of changes based on their age and what they're more likely to encounter. So, if a little kid is thinking about, oh, well, if I see someone being mean to someone else, maybe I should tell someone. An older kid, you might want to start asking them, if you see someone online posting about wanting to shoot up a school, who are you going to tell? And those are more relevant questions for tweens and teens when that unfortunately becomes more of an issue. And also, you can start doing digital literacy of content itself. So suppose a 16-year-old sees a new news article that frightens them. You can really start exploring the who, what, where, when, and why of these articles, this content, this news that you see online, and to really get to a sense that they kind of have more control, not of the news itself, more control over, how much stock to put in it, and how they should how they should really appraise this in a way that can change their behavior accordingly. And so, for example, I see a lot of minority youth in my practice now, and occasionally a lot of them will see these news articles about ICE, and sometimes that will kind of cause some kids to spin. And so I've been able to sort of sit with kids and kind of say, okay, where did you see this news article? It's really important to think about where that information came from, and what that person was trying to say when they wrote that article, and kind of help them calm down and realize that, some of the news articles may not be as kind of immediate as they seem to think when they see the article initially. And obviously it's really important for adults to do this too, and that is mixed results in the adult population, but it's increasingly important for adults, for youth and adults to start engaging in digital literacy skills from news articles from a very early age, because now primarily kids get their news from social media platforms rather than actual accredited news sources. Common Sense Media can also offer a way for people to learn about apps and games prior to their use. So I always recommend, if parents are at all interested about their kids' use of a particular game, before they let them get on the game or the app, they should check it out and see what their kids are actually going to be seeing and exposed to. And so you can see that it addresses sex, addresses language, addresses drinking and drugs, all things that would be critical to know before your kid engages in that game or app. And then other kind of the ultimate form of prevention, right, is media planning. So the American Academy of Pediatrics has done an excellent digital media planning guide for a family media plan. This is the link, and it's in English or Spanish. And it is extremely user-friendly, very easy to do. It is great for tailoring media plans for kids of multiple ages within a home. And it helps give you tips and guidance specifically around that age group. So if you list one age, they'll be like, this is what we recommend, you help to plan around. However, I will say that it has less utility as an intervention plan. So more about that. So every media plan needs to give you a sense of what types of media should be being used, who you're talking to, how much you're using, when you're using it, and where you're using it. Those are the biggest things. And the American Academy of Pediatrics does all that. That plan has all these things, which is great. But contingency planning and monitoring are other areas of a media plan that I think should also be incorporated, and those aren't addressed with that plan. So in terms of contingency planning, I think all youth should be thinking about, I guess all parents or anyone working on media plans should be thinking about areas where you want to say, like, if these things go south, your media use will be affected how? And that, because these are the most common areas where parents would be like, you're not doing well in school, taking that device away. So things like academic performance, school attendance, chores and responsibilities, and just your behavior at home or at school. More specific to high-risk users of social media, contingency planning really has to take into account unsafe behaviors, as well as coping skills and the use of the kid to start engaging in different coping skills that aren't social media. And what do I mean by that? So in terms of contingency planning, I think it's very common for a lot of the parents that I work with to say, okay, well, basically my contingency plan is that they can only use their phone if X happens, right? And they can't have any devices if X happens or X doesn't happen. And I think it's important to be a little bit more creative about that, because unfortunately I've seen far too much in my practice times when acute removal of devices can lead to really bad safety outcomes, like suicide attempts, destroying houses, physical aggression. I've seen attempted stabbings. Like, it can get very, very frightening very fast. So if at all possible, unless there are acute safety concerns that should prompt consideration of complete removal, I always recommend to try to use other methods as consequences if a child has not been able to meet the goals of the family, right? Or like academic performance or behavior, so on and so forth. And so those include things like maybe decreasing the screen time by 30 minutes or to 30 minutes daily, or using devices only with parental supervision, or losing only your smartphone, right? Those are all sort of ways to impose consequences without necessarily having to remove the devices entirely. And the biggest advice I can always give about media planning in general is please be as specific as possible. I will always find that when we're working with parents, just like really, if you think that it can't get any more specific, make it more specific, because it can always get more specific. And just look at the difference between what's on the left and what's on the right. So if you watch videos about cutting online, you lose your phone. That's typically what I see when I'm going over media plans with parents. And unfortunately, though, that leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and kids are terrible with uncertainty. And so unfortunately, with that as a rule, that then wreaks havoc, right? It's a kid being like, I have no idea when I'm going to get my phone back. I have no idea what's going to happen when I get my phone back. I don't know what it's needed for me to get my phone back. And then they just get really escalated and sometimes aren't really able to move forward with any sort of productive media planning. So I really encourage parents to try to be as specific as possible, saying, you lose your phone for how long and how will you get it back? And you are able to get it back if you were able to do the following things. Those are all great ways you can make a media plan more specific. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about monitoring unsafe social media use through other means other than media plans. Operating systems in general all have built-in controls that you can block websites and filter content. But more recently, there have been a lot of third-party parental control services that have taken off, and they are able to do far more Big Brother-like things, like monitor content in addition to filtering it, both that your teen accesses as well as content that they type. It can actually impose time limits, and it can also track your teen and track everything they're doing. Full disclosure, putting myself out there, I am not a huge fan of these apps. One, consider that these are expensive. These apps are they're expensive, and they tend to prey on parental fear as a way to get parents to get kind of upgrade and get more ways to monitor their kid, right? But also, as we've talked about a lot in this talk, kids are supposed to individuate. They're supposed to turn into a full-fledged adult, hopefully at some point. And you really want them to get to the point where they recognize what things are worrisome and problematic for them, and that they can see things that might be a danger and then go to a trusted adult if need be. And you also want parents to get to the point where they feel like they have taught their kid enough so that the kid can be trusted to be online appropriately. And so I think that unfortunately, if you're constantly telling your teenager that you trust them, but yet simultaneously you are tracking their every single move, it's really mixed messages. And I think you really run some major risks by constantly monitoring a teen through one of those apps. As I always like to say, my super big nerd self, this is from Jurassic Park, life finds a way, but the adolescent will find a way. And so really at the end of all of this, I just think it's super important that parents know that while it's their decision what their kids are using and whether or not kids have access to devices, at the end of the day, it's also not their decision, because kids will find a way, teens will find a way. Monitoring only goes so far, and kids are very savvy at getting around it very quickly. So it's more important to sort of work with the kid originally through media planning and through talking about safety online and digital literacy early on, so that this isn't something that you're then having to deal with all at the end, right? We always want people to sort of tackle all this in the beginning, ideally, and really build good skills, good concrete skills, such that you don't have to worry about on the tail end sort of fixing all these problems. So I leave you with that. The adolescent always finds a way. All right, thank you. I hope I didn't go too over.
No, we were actually a little ahead on time, so that worked out perfectly. Thank you so much, Dr. Gassner, I'm sorry. I don't know, we do have a couple minutes for questions. I know that someone did ask in the chat about what kids think of folks that don't use social media. I know my teen boys love to tease my husband, who only has Facebook that he barely uses, and he purposely makes comments about face chats and snap talks and instatubes and gets a lot of eye rolls. But joking aside, Dr. Gassner, do you have a comment about teens' perspectives about those that don't use social media, and perhaps any impact on counselors who work with youth if they're not social media savvy?
Yeah, you know, a while ago, I actually did a study talking to the youth in my outpatient clinic. Those were coming in for outpatient appointments for mental health visits, asking them about, you know, what they thought about doctors or mental health clinicians or counselors, anyone really that they're seeing in the clinic, asking them about their social media use. And by and large, the majority of them were like, why would they want to ask me? I didn't think that they would care. No one asks about that. And so there were some, full disclosure, that were like, no, heck no, I'm not going to let anyone ask me about my social media use. That's weird. But a lot of them were actually, the majority were more interested in having practitioners ask them about what they're doing online and caring about what they're doing online. And so I think that even if you're not an avid user of social media, and I admit I don't have an Instagram, I'm not on Snapchat, I don't really use TikTok as much as my husband does. You know, I'm not cool, but I always ask my patients about what they're doing. And I think just as long as you show interest and care, it really doesn't matter how behind the times you are. So that would be my answer to that. Other specific questions?
Anyone else? Feel free to throw something in. Oh, there was a question about thoughts on Discord platform.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of, I mean, Discord, I think by and large is prey to some of the same issues that I mentioned throughout the chat. I don't know that it's at all different. Obviously, there's a somewhat different audience on Discord, given who, you know, that it's mostly tailored to gamers. But I will say that, you know, there's still a lot of this kind of toxic behavior that you have on other social media platforms occurs through Discord. And I think, unfortunately, also, you know, that tends to still be a platform where kids are far more likely to have and be on it than parents. And so parents do have a tendency sometimes of being more like, you can't go on Discord. And so I will say I've probably had more patients get into trouble on Discord than like with in their interactions with others through Discord than I have with other platforms. I think because to some degree, maybe they're not being talked about as much anymore with their parents and their use of it. I don't have like alternative thoughts about Discord in particular, as in terms of like whether or not, you know, people should be using it, mainly because, as I said, I think kids will find a way to use it. But I do think that there's less familiarity with the app overall with providers and parents. And so I think that also just breeds a tendency for them to be like, no, you can't use this. And then that probably increases the risk of bad things happening, because then kids will be like, I had a kid who was being again, sexually extorted through Discord, and she was not supposed to be using the platform. Mom didn't know what it was like, don't use that. And unfortunately, then she just went for months in that situation without seeking out help. What are your thoughts on engaging parents of elementary school kids around safe social media use? That would be awesome and amazing. But I also recognize that everyone in schools are so burdened already. I think that if there was a way for us to really implement a curriculum that was consistent, and we could actually like test and pilot a curriculum kind of across districts and manualize it, that would be amazing. Because I think right now, there are definitely curriculums out there, but certainly they're not standardized. And to my knowledge, they haven't been piloted in a way that we can say like, this works in a longitudinal fashion. But we do need to start at elementary school. I've spoken to several different schools, and everybody that I've spoken to is always like, we need this earlier. And I do think that that's true, right? As a physician and as a parent, I'm seeing that it's important early on. As long as a kid's using screens, they need to start recognizing the impact the screens can have on them and safe use of screens. So should happen, I would say, as early as kindergarten, probably not earlier than kindergarten. Most of the issues that ended up in his suspension of students last year were instigated from the use of Discord. Yeah, that I would not be surprised about.
I have a question. Do you have any like current information on any sort of initiative within the like law enforcement on making it? Because from my experiences is that it's so behind the technology. The laws and the regulations are so behind that that's why so many platforms, like you were saying earlier, can be shut down. But they quickly just find a loophole around it. And when I've spoken to detectives before and stuff, they say that they're just so behind the game. And I was just wondering if you had any more current information on making that a less of a gap.
I don't. I mean, admittedly, I'm not aware of where there might be initiatives cropping up. I hope that there are, certainly. It's very needed. I know that a lot of us have been trying to figure out how we can join forces of all interested parties to actually just turn to the social media companies rather than trying to go through law enforcement, and really see if we can work with social media companies to try to remove some of the, for example, with all these mass shootings, try to like figure out how we can remove the increasing chances of things being reported right to platforms and it not going anywhere. Like, it's amazing to me that people could report and individuals could report someone who's talking about a mass shooting to platforms, and there's no transparency. We have no idea what happened with that information. And so there really needs to be more transparency on the part of social media platforms with that information, because law enforcement should have gotten involved a lot sooner in some of these, and it didn't. And there is still this big gap in between our ability to, I guess, police these in a way that it can, is helpful and constructive. And so, as you said, we're always playing catch up. So I wish I had a more concrete answer to your question. I know that a lot of us are trying to figure out how we can make more of a difference for cases where we think that law enforcement probably will end up getting involved, and social media platforms don't seem to tend to take any action. But that's more on the side of social media platforms rather than law enforcement specifically.
Yeah, I had a question. Earlier you mentioned the Ohio study that kids that on social media committed suicide and something.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit, so I can't hear you that well.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier about the Ohio study where students were making copycat suicides. Now we've seen that, we know about that. Is that primarily because they're getting attention, the people who have done it? Is that why it's being copycatted for the most part?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As I mentioned, like suicide contagion itself through media, we've known about that for hundreds of years. So, the trials of young Werther, I think, was like the first, as we know, like kind of popular example of copycat suicides from a really important piece of literature at the time. So, I don't know that we have a full understanding, but I think there's kind of a mix, right? Like on the one hand, for like parasuicidal gestures and maybe suicidal ideation, I do think that there's a component of like, if I post this, I could get attention, I'm crying, there is a cry for help there. I think that is part of it. But what has also been talked about is called the Papageno effect, based on Mozart's The Magic Flute. And basically that's the idea of suicide just being an option, being on the table, right? That being like, for someone, that being the only option and presented almost as the only option. And so, in that opera, basically, once people are able to say like, there are other things you can live for and can transition, you can say, okay, there are other things I could do rather than commit suicide. And unfortunately, when you have these high profile I guess cases, not really a case in 13 Reasons Why, but like these big media shows of like suicide being the answer, even if people are saying like this shouldn't have happened, it's still being presented as an answer and the answer. And unfortunately, I think there's the risk of sort of developing tunnel vision for a lot of youth and saying, okay, well, that was the answer to that problem, and so I should then act accordingly. We know executive functioning is extremely limited in kids who are struggling psychiatrically, and so unfortunately, I think it's probably the mix of both. For some, it's probably more intention based, but I think for those maybe who make attempts, it's more of a like, I just don't know what other option. This is an option that's being presented to me, and I'm going to follow suit.
So, question then is follow up. So, when a school identifies this may happen in the community or on social media, do you recommend some type of outreach for that? Like, because right now what we do is if something happens on campus or off campus, it's in our community, right? Counselors show up, we offer that we're available, and if we hear something, we pull kids out. But do you have any more of a proactive approach that we should use?
Yeah, I think, I don't know how helpful that would be to target the students directly. So I don't, like, for example, I don't know that it would make as much of a difference telling a bunch of students like, don't look at suicide related posts, right? Like, I don't think that's going to make it as much of a difference as just, I think we don't do a good enough job explaining suicide contagion. And also I think even just talking about the various ways in which we know that suicide related posts can actually then instill people to want to act on that, right? So there's a list of whole guidelines for media on how to talk about suicides, and they're all based on research that's been done on suicide contagion. And so to my knowledge, and there may be school districts out there that are are better at this. I certainly don't know numerous school districts, but I think if they were able to start talking about those, not only within, we always talk about them as it relates to media, but we don't talk about them to staff of schools and saying, like, if kids are posting about this, in a way, and they're kind of and this part actually probably could be talked about with youth, maybe teens more than tweens, but saying, like, when you post things like, oh, they're in a better place now, even saying something like that, that is something that's definitely you're not allowed to write about that if you're writing about a suicide in the media. But social media posts don't have the same rules. And that's what's concerning, right? Is that if someone commits suicide and you go on their Facebook page, I'm totally dating myself here, but you go on their page and there's a bunch of people saying, hey, you've gone to a better place, your suffering is at an end. If there is someone that is already maybe on the fence and struggling with depression and sees that, that's an idea of, like, hey, this is that option. And we don't talk about that. And, I don't think schools talk about that by and large. I think, unfortunately, a lot of it is kind of like, just shut it down and don't talk about it. And then nothing, and that's different from contagion, right? Like, talking about it in and of itself is not contagion, but presenting it in a certain way is. And so I think just being more transparent about, how you can talk about suicide in a way that is safe versus, pretending it didn't happen, or just kind of dealing with it quietly and pushing it under the rug and being like, we're here if you need us. That might not actually be as helpful, because people are going to take to social media, and when they do, that's not going to be monitored or held to the same criteria as a media outlet source, for example. So I think if schools were better able to do that, that would be wonderful. But I also recognize that your resources are limited. So, I know certainly here in the Cambridge area, they don't. We've had suicides, and they kind of do. They reach out, if people need supports, that's we're here, and I don't know that really does everything justice. So
definitely is more to think about. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gasner. We appreciate your time with us today. Such helpful, useful information. I think we could probably allow people to ask you questions for another 30 minutes. But with respect for everyone's time, we will stop there. If anyone does have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and our team will collect those, and we can reach out to any of our presenters and ask them for some feedback that we can send out to you all. So I hope you're all feeling as please share a chat in the comment about something that resonated with you today. Something that you'll consider, something that you plan to utilize in your work as the school year begins. So if you can throw something in the chat, and as you do that, also grab your phone and snap a picture of your comment to serve as a reminder of your personal action plan. And if you want to take that a step further, you can snap that picture and send it to a colleague so that you can have an accountability partner of how you'll use information that you learned today. So also, Sochi will be adding a Google survey link in the chat, and we ask if you can complete that so that we can hear your feedback and thoughts about this, what I think was a wonderful workshop, but we'd love to hear from you. And while all of that is happening in the chat, let's get to our anticipated raffle.